a college student with a bright future.
He was a journalism and history major who planned to go to law school.
He had a huge social group. He was very well liked.
Is found murdered in the middle of town.
The wound was so deep, the blade of the knife nicked the spine.
Sending police hunting for an elusive killer.
This case was a true mystery, a true whodunit.
He was depicted as a promiscuous young man who could have been killed by anybody.
And when they catch him, it leaves everyone blindsided.
They did not want to believe this was true.
And that was pretty surprising.
When we figured out who did it, I refused to believe it.
Columbia, Missouri is best known as the home of the University of Missouri.
I think many people would consider us a college town. This is a city, small city with 30,000 students, coming in.
For the Columbia Police Department, a neighborhood of rowdy kids is usually as bad as it gets.
Mainly a lot of college-related crimes, such as the parties and alcohol offenses. Homicides in general were unheard of.
That all changes one afternoon in June 2004.
I received a call that someone had found a body in the East Campus area, and because I'm the East District Commander, I headed towards the scene.
Schwartz arrives to find a team of officers already securing the area.
The body was in between two apartments, lying face up, and he only had boxer shorts on. His throat had been slit, most probably with a knife. It was a very large and gaping wound. It was very deep. There's a few other abrasions on the upper body. So it was a very violent action, just a very violent crime.
I was a student in college, and seeing this in a place I knew really well was tough.
The forensics team processes the scene while police search the area carefully, but they can't locate a murder weapon or ID on the body.
We started talking with people in the area to see if anyone knew this particular person.
This was a part of town where everybody really knows everybody else. Everybody knows everybody else's business.
One onlooker thinks they recognize the dead young man.
The body was identified as Jesse Valencia. He was a young man attending the University of Missouri, and we found out that he lived in the neighborhood, block and a half from where we found his body.
The 23-year-old lived alone in an apartment just off campus. Police need to know if that's where the crime got its start.
We opened it up and started to look for any initial type evidence, trying to figure out who could have done this and for what reason.
The forensic team does a thorough sweep of the apartment, bagging Jesse's cell phone, cigarettes, and other items, while police canvass neighbors to see if they noticed anything suspicious the night before.
His neighbor admitted coming home drunk about 3 in the morning and going to bed. He was awakened by yelling that was going on next door. This neighbor actually pounded on the door and then went back to sleep.
The neighbor recalls that the shouting was late, almost 4 o'clock in the morning. Police are curious who is in the apartment with Jesse and what could they have been arguing about.
That obviously started to help us narrow down the time frame of when this may have occurred, but that's all we had to work with at that point.
There were no real clues as to who had murdered this young man.
A few hours into the investigation, another young man arrives at the scene in a flood of tears.
This guy named Jack Barry told investigators he was Jesse's former boyfriend who just lived a few blocks away. A friend had called Jack Barry saying that Jesse was dead.
If he had a relationship with Jesse Valencia, he was definitely a person the detectives wanted to talk to.
Jack agrees to come down to the station for routine questioning. But first, he helps detectives track down Jesse's family in Kentucky.
They called me on the phone, and a detective told me that Jesse had been killed, and I pretty much just took off running through the house and ran out my front door screaming. Just too much. Even when he was a little boy, Jesse never had trouble making friends. Everybody wanted to be around him because he was constantly smiling and laughing. And Jesse told me he was gay when he was 10 years old. He started crying, he got pretty emotional, and he said that he was afraid that I was gonna hate him. And I told him that there was nothing in the world that could make me hate him. After that, he seemed pretty comfortable with himself.
As a teen, Jesse's confidence bloomed.
Jesse loved to talk. He loved meeting new people, making new friends. When he was in high school, he wanted to try modeling. He did really well at it, and I always thought that he wouldn't go back to school, but a year from the date that he told us that he wanted to be a model, he said he wanted to be a lawyer. That's what he decided to do, and that's why he went to Missouri.
Linda said he was a journalism and history major who planned to go to law school.
Jesse Valencia was one of those larger-than-life characters. He had such a big personality. He had a lot of friends. He had a huge social group.
Now, detectives need to find out who cut Jesse's life short in such a horrific way. They start by asking Jack Barry about his relationship with Jesse.
Jack told them he and Jesse had just split up, and he was trying to make Jesse realize it's over. I need to move on. Jesse still loved Jack, so he was having a hard time letting go. But Jack was already starting to see someone else.
Was it a fight with a spurned lover that the neighbor had heard in the middle of the night?
It was possible Jack had some type of confrontation with Jesse that led to his death.
And when investigators asked Jack for an alibi, it turns out that he doesn't seem to have one.
His alibi was, I was home sleeping alone. At that point, Jack Barry had become the primary suspect.
Coming up, detectives discover a secret romance
They had started a relationship very quickly.
that uncovers a killer's trail
A lie is the next best thing to a confession.
to a surprising culprit.
It was shocking on many levels.
Detectives in Columbia, Missouri are questioning a man who had recently split up with murdered college student Jesse Valencia.
Jack Berry wanted to end the relationship. He wasn't happy with the relationship any longer.
Jack paints a picture of a couple growing apart after 2 years of dating. But a piece of evidence found at Jesse's apartment makes detectives question his story.
The investigating detectives found Jesse's cell phone, and the cell phone showed that Jesse had called Jack Berry at about 3:18 that night.
The neighbors had heard some type of an argument from the victim's apartment, approximately the time frame of when this occurred. So that would be obviously suspicious.
But Jack insists he was nowhere near Jesse's apartment.
Jack said that he had already gone to bed that night and that he heard a knock on his door at 3:18 in the morning, and then he simultaneously got a phone call from Jesse's cell phone. It was routine that Jesse would use his cell phone as sort of a doorbell. Jack said he was tired and he really didn't feel like getting up and talking to his former boyfriend at 3:18 in the morning, so he didn't go to the door.
Jack says he rolled over and went back to sleep, but police aren't so sure and question him for hours.
Finally, Jack broke into tears, and he said he regretted that. He didn't go to the door because what happened might not have happened had he done that. His reaction was so genuine, and it was clear that Jack still had a lot of love and affection for Jesse.
And it's becoming clear to detectives that Jack didn't kill Jesse, but they press him to see if he might know who did.
Jack said that he had no clue as to what would have happened to him and why anyone would have killed him.
23-year-old Jesse Valencia, the MU student.
Police found Valencia's body on East Campus, throat slashed.
As the story of the murder hits the 11 o'clock news, it sends shockwaves through the city.
I would say this was probably one of the most gruesome killings in Columbia. We don't have very many murders here.
The murder of a gay young man just a week before the city's first Pride Fest horrifies the progressive college community.
For anyone who thinks that they can get away with something like this so heinous is just unthinkable. We know from past homicides that a majority of them are with people that they know. Anyone who had had contact with him, whether in a sexual relationship or a social relationship, the detectives wanted to talk to.
Police begin to make the rounds of Jesse's wide circle of friends, wondering if there's anyone in his life that might have harbored any kind of grudge. One name they hear over and over is Zev Feintuck, a student that Jesse had met 2 weeks earlier at a political rally.
Jesse's friends had said, oh, maybe it was this guy because he didn't seem quite normal. There was something that made him a little bit different from other people.
Several of Jesse's friends, they said that Zev wasn't comfortable in his own skin and that he had a lot of issues with being himself. There was some contention whether Zev and Jesse were having a romantic relationship. They were spending a lot of time together.
Rumors about the two young men had been swirling, and after Jesse was murdered, the gossip about Zev began to take a sinister tone.
Somebody saw someone matching his description, looking disheveled and crying, walking down the street the morning of the murder, and a car he was known to drive was seen in that area.
That's when the detectives started looking towards him and started talking with him and seeing what he had to say.
Detectives call Zev down to the station, but he denies that the rumors about him and Jesse are true.
Zev said they'd never had a sexual relationship, that they were friends. Then Zev would come over and he'd hang out with him.
Police questioned Zev about where he was between 3 and 5 a.m.
His alibi was I was home sleeping. He was a young man who still lived with his parents.
They subject Zev to a voice stress analysis test to see if he is telling the truth.
It showed untruthful, so deceitful, that did seem to be some evidence of guilt.
Detectives quickly follow up with a visit to his parents, but they confirm that their son was home all night.
Zev's parents had said that when Zev would leave, he would always go through the garage door to get to the car, and so it made a big racket. They would have awakened his parents, and they said there's no way that he would have left that night. It seemed like he did have an alibi.
With Zev Feintuck discounted as a suspect, detectives continue to piece together the last hours of Jesse Valencia's life.
The detectives were talking with several of the friends of Jesse Valencia to see where he was on the evening and early morning hours that this occurred.
Police learned that Jesse had gone to a party at a friend's house around 11 p.m. on the night he was killed.
Some friends of Jesse said that Friday night, Jesse was at a party with a young man named Ed McDevitt.
Ed McDevitt was somebody Jesse had just met. Ed was a chef in town. They had met just a couple of nights before and had started a relationship very quickly.
Jesse's friends tell police that the two men left the party together, heading in the direction of Jesse's house.
And that was around 3 o'clock in the morning on the last night of Jesse's life.
It appears as though Ed McDevitt might have been the last person to see Jesse alive.
And it was possible Ed McDevitt went home with Jesse and then killed him.
"12 hours after finding Jesse Valencia's body, detectives track down 22-year-old Ed McDevitt and bring him down to the station.
Jesse had met Ed McDevitt 2 days before his death and invited Ed to come home with him on that Friday night, the last night of Jesse's life, so he became a suspect at that point.
But Ed claims that he and Jesse went their separate ways soon after they left the party.
And he was talking with Jesse on the phone at the time he was walking home on the last night of Jesse's life.
Ed says that his roommate was up when he arrived home and invites detectives over to talk to him themselves.
There's nothing found when they search his home, and everything Ed McDevitt told the officers, they could verify by looking at his cell phone records, by talking to his roommate, and at that point, investigators let him go.
Police hope the DNA results pending at the lab will help them link one of their suspects to Jesse's murder. Desperate for answers, Jesse's mom grows more despondent, recalling an eerie premonition Jesse had years ago.
From the time Jesse was 7 years old, he had told me that he was going to die at a young age. He said, "I'm going to die at a young age, and I love all of you, and I always will love you, but I'll be okay." He would always end it with, "I'll be okay." And of course I got emotional and upset over it, but he said, "We've got to make the most of what time I'm here."
A day after Jesse's murder, detectives receive the autopsy report and study it closely for clues.
The medical examiner concluded that Jesse had been murdered in the area of 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. The cut to his neck was the only knife wound, and it was the cause of death. And it was so deep, the blade of the knife had also nicked the spine.
The lack of defense wounds suggests that Jesse had been taken by surprise.
The most mysterious thing was that across his breastbone there were bruises, and in the middle of his back between his shoulder blade there were bruises.
The evidence suggests that Jesse was easily overpowered in the vicious attack.
investigators hope that additional lab work will reveal even more and point to a killer.
There were fingernail scrapings collected during the autopsy, and also some hairs were found on his chest, and that was sent to the crime lab for analysis.
Until the crime lab turns up DNA, police have no choice but to move on to their next lead.
A lot of Jesse's friends were being brought in, they were giving evidence, they were helping out with information.
One of those friends is a fellow student named Andy.
Andy Schermerhorn was a young man who had what they called a friends with benefits arrangement with Jesse.
Andy was out of town the night Jesse was killed, but the day after the murder, he comes forward to share a shocking story.
Andy Schermerhorn told the investigating detectives that Jesse was having sex with a Columbia police officer.
He was having a relationship with an officer. I was surprised.
Andy nervously reveals an encounter 3 weeks prior at Jesse's apartment.
Andy Schermerhorn said that on May 14th, he had been at Jesse's home at night, and there was a knock at the door. And Jesse went to the door, and a uniformed police officer was there. And Jesse said, "It's okay, oh, it's okay, he's cool, he's cool."
According to Andy, the officer took off his gun belt, and the next thing Andy knew, the three of them were fooling around.
After it was over, the police officer said, "This has got to be a secret."
A secret affair between an officer and a murder victim is a major red flag.
If any one of our officers had been seeing Jesse Valencia, why is he not being forthcoming? If you have nothing to hide, why not just tell us?
Detectives need to know who this officer is.
They said, "Do you think you'd be able to recognize him if you saw him again?" And he said yes, because it had only been about 2 weeks since that incident.
Detectives ask Andy if he'll look through a book containing the photo of every officer in the Columbia Police Department.
They were having him walk down the hall where he was going to look at the yearbook. Andy Schermerhorn flipped through it without even looking at the pages closed, and Schermerhorn began trembling, and he said, "I passed him in the hallway just now. It was him."
The day after the murder of Jesse Valencia, detectives in Columbia, Missouri learned that he was allegedly having a relationship with a local police officer.
Jesse's friend Andy Schermerhorn told the investigating detectives that he was an eyewitness to this sexual activity. Schermerhorn began trembling, and he said, "It was him that I passed in the hallway just now." And that was Stephen Arthur Rios.
Stephen Rios' commander believes Andy must be mistaken about the officer's identity.
When the detectives told me that maybe Steve had been having a relationship with the victim, I told the detectives, "You're absolutely wrong. He was married to a wonderful young lady, and they had just had their first child."
Schwartz knows the 27-year-old Rios well. The 5-year veteran is one of the department's rising young stars.
Steve was very outgoing. He communicated well, very ambitious.
He was a young officer who was on his way up in the department because he was a go-getter and a very, very popular officer.
Detectives don't know if Andy is telling the truth, but they're certainly anxious to get Rios' side of the story.
if he was having a relationship. That does not mean that he had killed Jesse Valencia.
Rios is out of town for a couple of days on a camping trip with coworkers. So they begin tracing Rios' steps the day Jesse's body was found.
He went in for his work shift later in the afternoon, like he normally did, and at that point, the body had been found.
The sergeant on duty that day had told me that Rios was coming to the scene to help identify the body. He had contacted the on-duty sergeant, but said he could help.
Rios said that I met Jesse Valencia when I gave him a ticket back on April 18th.
Investigators pull a copy of the incident report to see if it backs up Rios' story.
April 18th of 2004, some friends of Jesse's were having a party, and the party kept getting loud, and the police showed up to get them to quiet down. And Jesse, this intelligent pre-law major, said, "What's your probable cause?" Well, that got him arrested, and Stephen Rios gave him a municipal court summons for obstructing a governmental operation.
A call to Jesse's mother corroborates the report.
Jesse told me that when he was arrested, that the cop that drove him down to the jail was really nice, and that he talked to him all the way down to the station. And he said, I kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable because he kept asking me personal questions about my life that I didn't really feel like he should be asking me when he was trying to arrest me for something.
But the arrest wasn't the end of the officer's interest. The very next day, he turned up at Jesse's apartment.
After he got arrested, Jesse called me on the phone, and he said, the cop that arrested me last night showed up on my doorstep. He said he had to ask me some more questions, but the questions he was asking Jesse were more of a personal nature. They went out a few times after that, and he would come to Jesse's apartment and just show up unannounced, even when he was in uniform.
Linda doesn't know much more than that, but thinks that Jesse's friend Joan Sheridan might. When they track her down 2 days after the murder, Joan confirms that Jesse saw the officer more than once after the arrest.
He had told her that the officer would typically come by sometime after 3 o'clock and before 6 o'clock in the morning, just for sex, and then leave.
Joan reveals that she got a close-up look at the officer one night when he showed up at Jesse's place.
They showed her a photo lineup, and she was able to pick the person that came by to Jesse's apartment that night. And it was Stephen Rios.
Detectives now have more evidence that Rios was having a scandalous relationship with Jesse. And when they hear what Joan says next, they suspect he may also have a motive for murder.
Joan said that when he went to court for his municipal court summons, Jesse assumed it would be dismissed since he was having sex with the arresting officer, and it had not been dismissed, and that had angered Jesse. So Jesse had told Joan that the next time the police officer comes over, I'm going to tell him that I have a little secret the chief of police might want to know if he doesn't get that ticket dismissed.
The detectives called me and told me that Jesse was threatening to contact the chief and expose Rios. Finally, the light bulb went off. You start looking at who had a motive to kill Jesse Valencia. Rios was very worried about his job. He was very worried about his reputation. He would be very devastated. He would be embarrassed by this information coming out.
That's when Rios became the suspect.
It's a serious matter to accuse one of their own. Investigators quickly regroup to plan the best approach.
They didn't feel they were ready to interview him yet. They were wanting to have the DNA evidence come back before they actually confronted him. But all of a sudden, Rios showed up at the police department and said, "Oh, could I talk to you for a second?"
He had this look on his face, like he was very upset. Very upset.
Coming up, detectives get a devastating phone call.
Steve called me crying, very upset, and he said, "I've done a bad thing."
And the investigation takes an unexpected new turn.
The officers found him on the 4th floor of a parking garage.
What was he thinking?
Detectives investigating the murder of college student Jesse Valencia are preparing to confront their suspect, police officer Steven Rios. But Rios goes on the offensive first.
Rios said he was hearing from other people that Jesse was having an affair with a Columbia police officer. And I just wanted you to know that I did give him a ticket, but that's the only contact I had with him, and it's certainly not me.
But detectives tell him flat out that they've heard a different story.
They said, "We've talked to a woman who said that she was at Jesse's apartment one night when you showed up." Rios sat there for a minute. And then Rios said, "Well, you know what? We did become social friends, but it never became anything like a sexual relationship." They said, "You know, we've talked to another young man who says he was actually having sex with Jesse, and you came by that night and actually came in and joined them on the bed." And Rios said, "What, sex?" Like it was the most astounding and false accusation you could ever heard.
He was getting very agitated with the detectives. He's a very prideful person, and he was very upset because they didn't believe him.
It's easy to see that Rios is lying. Detectives bear down hard. And finally, their suspect breaks.
Finally, Rios admitted that he had sex with Jesse. He tried to claim it was just that one time, and then it evolved into that he had had sex with Jesse as many as 6 times.
It's a stunning admission and a strong motive for murder.
He was embarrassed. He obviously did not want this information out if he was keeping it secret to begin with, especially from his wife, you know, in his family.
Police may not have the physical evidence to prove that Rios is a killer, but they do have something that's almost as good.
We were able to prove that he was lying.
There's an old saying in law enforcement that a lie, a provable lie, is the next best thing to a confession. And Steven Rios was caught in lots of provable lies.
But detectives aren't finished interrogating their suspect. They ask for his whereabouts the night that Jesse was killed.
He said he had been at work and he got off at 3 o'clock in the morning like he normally did. And he said that that night he'd gone onto the rooftop of the parking garage with a few other officers, and they had drank a few beers before they went home. And he said he got home about 5:15 to 5:30, took a shower, and got in bed.
Detectives grill Rios for over 3 hours, looking for any cracks in his story.
He still maintained he'd had nothing to do with Jesse's death. At that point, investigators let him go. He was definitely a suspect, but the question remained, can we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Investigators' next step is to create a timeline for the night of Jesse's murder and see how Rios' alibi fits in.
His wife corroborated that he had gotten home in that 5:15 to 5:30 time frame.
Other officers confirm Rios worked until 3 a.m. and then had some drinks with them on the rooftop that night. The security door records reveal that Rios left the roof at 4:37 a.m., 45 minutes before he got home.
One of the detectives actually drove from the parking garage to Jesse's home the same time of night, and it was 3.5 minutes. He then drove from the scene of the murder to Rios' home, and it was 10 minutes.
This gave a window of time of 20 to 30 minutes that were potentially unaccounted for at the time that Jesse Valencia was apparently killed.
And this gave us a timeline that could show that Rios could have done this murder within that time.
Investigators search Rios' home, car, and work locker, but they uncover nothing to tie him to the crime. Then, out of the blue, Captain Schwartz receives an alarming phone call.
Steve called me crying, very upset, and he said, "I've done a bad thing." The first question I asked him was, "Where are you?" And he said that he was in Kansas City and that he had bought a shotgun. I really thought he was going to kill himself. And my first reaction was no. I said, "You need to just stop what you're doing, just come back. Just come back to Columbia and we'll get through it."
Captain Schwartz is able to talk Rios into driving the 150 miles back home, where police take him into custody.
Still wasn't under arrest, but he was put on a 96-hour hold for an involuntary commitment to a mental facility, just for observation to make sure that he wouldn't kill himself.
But Stephen Rios is still despondent. He manages to evade hospital security, and soon the entire Columbia police force is on alert.
I got a phone call that Steve had escaped and was on top of the parking garage, threatening suicide.
One of the officers found him on the 4th floor of a parking garage, and Rios climbed up on the wall, claiming he was going to jump.
When they called me and said he's on top of the garage, he's threatening suicide, what was he doing? What was he thinking?
Police officer Stephen Rios, a suspect in the murder of Jesse Valencia, has escaped protective custody and is threatening to lead to his death.
This is one of the busiest parts of campus. It's about 7 o'clock at night. He goes to the roof of the parking garage, starts threatening to jump.
There's a crowd below. There are people watching this. People are videotaping this, taking pictures. It's bizarre.
Police arrive on the scene to try to talk Rios off the ledge.
All I could think of was, here we go again. Why are you putting everyone through this? It was just putting everyone through a nightmare.
After a tense 45-minute standoff, they finally managed to talk Rios back from the brink.
He was taken back into custody and again put into a mental facility and put on a suicide watch while we were finishing our investigation to determine whether or not he would be charged with Jesse's murder.
3 weeks after Jesse's murder, the analysis of the hairs found on Jesse's chest give police the evidence they need to charge Rios with the crime.
They were able to say the persons who left those hairs on Jesse's chest, limb hairs that would have come from somebody's arm, those hairs matched to Stephen Rios. And that's when we realized that they teach Columbia police officers at the training academy how to administer a chokehold, and that cuts off the blood flow to the brain and renders a person unconscious in 3 to 8 seconds. That could account were these limb hairs in addition to the bruises that went across the front of his chest and in the middle of his back.
On July 1st, 26 days after Jesse Valencia's body was found, Stephen Arthur Rios is arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Did you kill Jesse Valencia?
No, I did not.
During the week-long trial, prosecutors lay out their theory of how the murder went down.
Rios came by after his shift was over, thinking they were going to have sex. Jesse confronted him.
Jesse was threatening to contact the chief and expose Rios.
And he knew his career and his happy marriage would probably be over. And that had angered Rios. The neighbor heard this argument going on, and Jesse's yelling, "Stop it, stop it." Jesse, then clad only in his shorts and barefoot, ran out, being chased by Stephen Rios. The Stephen Rios caught him from behind and choked him into unconsciousness, put him on the ground, cut his throat, and that's what I believe happened in the last minutes of Jesse Valencia's life.
Prosecutors know they have a strong case, but convincing a jury that a police officer is a murderer is sure to be a hard sell.
If even one of the 12 jurors feels like it's not the person, then you have a hung jury or a not guilty verdict.
After 8 long hours, the jury returns with a verdict.
The jury finds the defendant, Stephen Arthur Rios, guilty of murder in the second degree.
I did feel a great sense of relief and even pride when the case was over and Stephen Rios had not gotten away with murder.
Stephen Arthur Rios receives a sentence of life in prison for the slaying of Jesse Valencia.
I don't feel like that Jesse really got justice because I wanted the death penalty for him. He took my whole life away from me.
Anytime you have an officer who has done a heinous type act like this and taken someone's life, it is a huge stain. And for law enforcement everywhere.
For Jesse's mother, her son's legacy is in the way he lived his life, not the way it ended.
I want people to remember the Jesse that was constantly laughing and trying to make other people happy, because that's what Jesse lived for. He didn't want anybody to be sad. There's always the empty space. Everybody still misses him, and we talk about him daily.
For more information on an unexpected killer, go to Oxygen.com. A young woman with a big heart.
She was the most compassionate, caring, captivating person I've ever met. She was in a very good place in her life.
Murdered in a terrifying attack.
Somebody set the body on fire and left. Her last few minutes of life was pure hell.
Detectives discover a secret affair.
They had started to develop more of a relationship.
We told him straight up, "You're the killer, and we're going to have your DNA."
Then uncover a surprising suspect hunting for prey.
The night that she was murdered, she had answered a call.
There was a note of directions to a fictitious place.
He was trying to trick young women.
A second tragedy sparks terror in the community.
We may be dealing with a serial killer.
I lived in fear. I was terrified to go out at night.
Before a calculating killer is ultimately revealed.
This is not real. This can't be happening. This is crazy.
Just 90 minutes from the bright lights of Nashville, Tullahoma, Tennessee is a quaint city full of Southern charm.
Tullahoma is a very small town. Everybody knows everybody. Your teachers at the high school are the same teachers that taught your grandparents. The community is very close-knit.
The people there are genuine. It's a safe place to live. We don't have a lot of violent crime.
In the early morning of July 2nd, 2012, a grisly crime is discovered that sets the whole town on edge.
I got the call that a couple of younger people were driving down a very, very rural road, and they seen a fire. They were going to put the fire out. But when they went over there, they noticed that it was a body that was on fire and called 911. When I arrived at the scene, several other investigators were there and said, this is real bad. It appeared that foul play was involved. We wasn't sure that she was murdered at this spot. It appeared that somebody may have just pulled over or backed up, dumped the body, set the body on fire, and left.
There were some tire tracks. We couldn't plaster cast them because they were in gravel. I just kind of surveyed what we had. There was no evidentiary value. Where do we go from here?
First responders extinguish the fire, and investigators take a closer look at the scene.
As we worked our way closer to the body, you started to get a sense of, how horrible this actually was.
It's just like something you would see off of a movie. This is not real. This can't be happening. This is crazy. The victim was a young white female, possibly in her 20s.
There was star tattoos behind each one of her ears.
And there was a magnolia leaf tattoo. I remember she had a shirt on. It had something to do with the nursing technical school. She was undressed from the waist down. Body was partially burned and covered in soot. The fire was relegated to her pelvic area.
It led us to believe that there had been a sexual assault. Someone had obviously tried to burn the evidence up.
Her body was already in rigor. I would believe that she was deceased at the time of the fire.
What was very glaring was blunt force trauma to her head.
You could actually feel the broken bones in the skull.
Detectives immediately attempt to identify the young victim.
There was no purse, no cell phone, no license, no vehicle to help us identify who the victim was.
Investigators speak to the couple who made the 911 call.
They didn't know who the person was. They didn't see or hear anyone. It was obvious almost immediately. They didn't have anything to do with this homicide. It was very traumatic for them. They just couldn't believe it.
At the scene, I made the suggestion to put what information we had on social media to help us identify her.
Within a few short hours, local mother of four, Kelly Sharpton, sees the missing persons report posted online.
Mom was at work, and there was a post about a young girl that had been found. When she came across the section that said she had star tattoos, I was told that Mom screamed out in the middle of her office. And then, of course, she called the sheriff's office.
She introduced herself, and we started talking, and the description seemed similar. The tattoos seemed to match.
Kelly instantly heads down to the police station for a formal interview.
When we interviewed Kelly, she was distraught. She was crying, and she identified the body in Todd's office on pictures. The victim was her daughter, Megan Sharpton.
walked in and I immediately heard my mom sobbing, and I can still hear her to this day. She just said somebody killed her last night. And it took me a second to figure out what she had just said. And then it hit me that she was gone.
24-year-old Megan Sharpton was a bright young woman with a big heart.
She was genuine. She was the most compassionate, caring, captivating person I've ever met. She and I were really, really, really close. She had the best laugh. She was so fun.
I could count on Megan to do anything for me. I knew she was always there. She was absolutely hilarious, very bold, but at the same time, you could tell she didn't want to be the center of attention.
Regardless of who you were, where you were from, she didn't care. She really, truly cared for every single person.
Megan had decided to turn her caring nature into a career.
She was working herself, through nursing school. Megan would have been an amazing nurse. She had her head on straight and was, ready to get going with her career.
Along with her calling, Megan had also found love.
She lived with her boyfriend, Chris. They were together 3 to 4 years. They had the same, group of friends.
She was in a very good place in her life. She had lots of goals to go on to those next levels in school, in her career. Megan was about 2 months away from graduation. She was very excited about it. Never in a million years did I think that somebody would kill her.
Investigators start piecing together a timeline of Megan's last known movements.
I spoke to her that Sunday afternoon. It was about 4 or 5. We would go to Mom's on Sunday and visit and have dinner and just kind of hang out as a family.
But that Sunday was different. Megan said she would be skipping dinner as she had a last-minute job interview.
She said that she would head to Mom's at some point.
But Megan never showed up.
Later on that night, she wasn't there. It wasn't a concern for us. We all thought, okay, well, something else must have come up. She was on her own time, and we'll see her sometime tomorrow.
Tragically, it would only be a matter of hours before Megan is discovered dead and on fire.
I was very much in shock that day. It didn't sink in that somebody killed her. It was just very, very hard to process.
In the interview, Carrie and Megan's mom told us what kind of car she drives. We put a bolo out for that car.
When investigators ask who could have been responsible for Megan's death, her sister doesn't hesitate.
I said, Chris did it, Megan's boyfriend. And that is the only thing that made any sense to me. He asked me, why do you think Chris did it? I thought, Chris and Megan had an up and down relationship. They were like oil and water. They would be hot-headed and tempered at times.
Majority of the time that a female's killed in the United States, it's someone that knew her. As quick as we could, we want to talk to him.
He is a very high suspect.
Coming up, police learn Megan's love life is more complicated than it first appears.
Another person had actually been in a relationship with Megan.
Did a dangerous love triangle lead to Megan's death?
When someone is murdered like that, it's got to be a jilted lover.
She had intended to leave him. That would be an absolute motive for murder.
Just when detectives believe they have an airtight case, a new piece of evidence changes everything.
I saw the video, surveillance of that person.
It caught my attention big time.
Never would I have thought it would wind up like this.
Detectives investigating the vicious murder of 24-year-old Megan Sharpton in Tullahoma, Tennessee, have their first suspect, her 25-year-old boyfriend, Chris Farrell.
Chris and Megan, to me, had an off and on relationship. They were both very hot-headed at times, and there were bumps in their relationship.
Once Megan and Chris got together, they were inseparable, but towards the end of Megan's life, the relationship had started growing apart at that point.
As far as Chris is concerned, it was just the only person that was with her on a daily basis. That was the only thing that made sense.
As detectives prepare to bring in Chris for questioning, a fresh lead comes in.
The Bedford County Sheriff's Office had located her car. So I had picked up and rushed to where the car was found at.
The car was sitting out in a rural area between Tullahoma and Shelbyville, Tennessee, approximately 15 to 20 miles away from the crime scene where Megan was found.
This is an odd place, odd way to leave a car. The car was, that of any young person's. It was cluttery, but there was none of her personal effects.
Investigators do find one item that grabs their attention.
There was a note in the vehicle, and a girl's handwriting where Megan was going.
It was directions on how to get to an address.
The next thing was to find this address, but there was no address that fit the note.
The directions were to a fictitious place.
In talking to her mother, I learned that she had left to go to this job. Was this the directions that she was given? Did someone lure her here with the intention of doing harm to her? The way this thing was shaping up is that she was abducted where her car was found. She was killed somewhere else and was found on Awalt Road.
We just sealed that car off and sent it on to the crime lab for DNA testing.
Investigators then head to Megan's apartment to talk to her boyfriend, Chris.
The boyfriend was the first person we looked at. He was distraught. On the night of the murder, Chris had told us that he had left for work, and she had told him before he left she had accepted a job by phone that a girl she had went to school with recommended her for this job, and that she would return in the morning. And in fact, she didn't return. And he became worried, and he had reached out to her mother.
Following up on what Megan's sister, Carrie, had told them, detectives asked Chris if he and Megan had been having any problems.
Chris described him and Megan's relationship as a good relationship, that they had their ups and downs like anybody else, but that he would never hurt Megan.
Detectives are suspicious he might be hiding something. Why else would Megan's sister point the finger at him so readily? They asked Chris to come down to the station for further questioning.
We interviewed Chris, and he was visibly shaken.
When pressed about his relationship with Megan, Chris changes his story.
He was quite honest. He said, that they didn't have the best relationship, that, it'd been somewhat strained. He felt like that maybe she wanted him to have a better job or maybe be more career-orientated.
Megan was getting ready to graduate college and start her career, and I don't think Chris was there at that point in his life. He was still, wanted to be young.
Chris swears he had nothing to do with Megan's death.
Chris's alibi was that he was at work at a local department store where the majority of the night he's going to be on or near some sort of camera.
Chris tells police he left for work at 5 p.m. and was there past midnight. But until his alibi can be confirmed and Megan's time of death is determined, he remains on the suspect list.
From my interview with Chris, I learned that there was another person that lived in the house, Robbie Rosar.
Robbie was one of Chris's friends. He moved in there at the end. My first thought was Robbie hurt Megan. I'd never met in my life that I know, nothing about other than what Megan told me. He was a little rough around the edges, but Megan loved everyone.
I reached out that day and I asked him to come in. Robbie was a different person. Robbie was a little darker. little less happy person.
Investigators ask Robbie point blank where he was when Megan was murdered.
Robbie didn't have an alibi. Robbie showed us he had been texting her all night, even in the morning, worried about her.
He said, look, I'm not the killer. I want y'all to find out who killed Megan. And he was very, very adamant.
He wanted to prove his innocence, which was a good indication for me that he didn't do this.
But when detectives ask Robbie about the nature of their relationship, his answer leaves them stunned.
Robbie told me that he had actually been in a relationship with Megan, that they were in fact lovers, and that she had intended to leave Chris. It was a shocker.
Megan had told me a few weeks before her murder that her and Robbie had started to develop more of a relationship versus just friends.
When Chris knew about Robbie, that would be an absolute motive for murder.
And so, again, that's when we thought, did Chris do this? You know, if things got crazy and tensions got high and emotions ran high, this would be a motive for homicide.
A day after 24-year-old Megan Sharpton was violently killed, detectives suspect jealousy could have motivated her murder. Megan was having an affair, but did her boyfriend Chris know?
When someone is murdered like that, you always think it's got to be someone close to her. It's got to be like a jilted lover.
We brought Chris back in the interview room after speaking with Robbie, and we kind of dropped that bombshell on him just to see his reaction.
It turns out Chris did not know about the relationship. Chris was upset. He was visibly upset when he found out that Megan had had relations with Rob, but he maintained that he still loved her and that he'd never hurt her. Chris was sincere, and I believe that was true.
Both of them individually took polygraphs. The questions asked were very pointed, you know. Did you cause Megan's death? They were very straight up. They both passed.
When Chris and Rob's polygraph came in, it moved them down on the list of suspects. You can't really take them off the list of suspects. They're just simply too close to the victim, but it did move them down.
Putting Chris and Robbie on the back burner, detectives turned to the job offer Megan received the night she was killed. Could that have been connected to her death?
After the polygraph, I started mulling over Chris's interview and the original nuggets that he had given me about the job. He had told us that he thought that it had come in from a girl she had went to school with previously. He had said that I only remember her name is Naomi.
Investigators searched through school records and discover Megan had a classmate named Naomi Jones.
Finding her to talk to her about the possibility that she recommended this job to Megan was going to be very important. Had this job possibly led to her death? I went to Naomi's residence. I knocked on the door. Nobody there. I drug out my lawn chair and I sat in the front and I'm going to wait. I'm going to get this statement today. The neighbor kept looking over there like, who is this crazy guy? And I was like, you know, I need to talk to Naomi Jones. He knew the Joneses well enough to have called her. When talking to Naomi, I said, hey, you know, I'm Todd Hyman. I'm with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. I'm investigating the death of Megan Sharpton.
Naomi stated that, you know, she knew Megan. They wasn't close.
She went to school with the year before in nursing school. I learned that they rode to clinicals maybe once together, and she offered up the fact that her husband had drove them. Further talking to her, I learned that she didn't really like Megan for whatever reason. She was very to the point and said, you know, I wouldn't recommend that girl for anything.
Naomi says she has no knowledge of Megan's job offer or her death. While investigators consider their next move, the autopsy report comes in, and it contains a surprising detail.
The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the face and blunt force trauma. She was burned, so the soot had kind of hid the wound.
Megan was shot with the medical examiner's office believes to be a .22 caliber round.
Her skull was broken in several pieces. It's very possible she was hit with a pistol and shot with a pistol.
The autopsy revealed she was deceased at the time of the fire.
She was purposefully burned in an attempt to hide evidence.
The autopsy indicates the fire was set shortly before Megan's body was discovered at 1:18 a.m. on July 2nd. Her time of death was likely before midnight.
Her last moments alive were pretty terrifying.
The report also confirms what police suspected at the scene.
The doctor that performed the autopsy said that there was a presence of sexual assault. There was DNA present. I started feeling like there could be a resolution more quickly with that piece of evidence.
The DNA is rushed to the crime lab for analysis. Then, 2 days after Megan's death, detectives get another possible lead.
July the 4th, there was a guy in the creek fishing who found Megan's purse along with her driver's license, Social Security card. We never did find her cell phone.
Megan's cell is still missing, but investigators order her phone records, hoping they might point to her killer. As the days start to pass by, Megan's family becomes anxious for answers.
10 days after they found her body, we decided to raise a reward for any information leading to the killer of Meg's case.
Many in town begin to wonder if Megan's murder is connected to another high-profile investigation.
It was the same time frame as the Holly Bobo case that was going on. It was a whodunit, just as ours. It was in Darden, Tennessee, which wasn't too far from here. And, you know, immediately some citizens would ask me, do you think there's any connection?
As detectives compare both cases, they have a chilling realization.
Holly Bobo was a nursing student also. She was abducted from her home. I don't believe her body had been recovered. We obviously had to look at the parallels. Was it a nursing student serial killer?
It's another lead and it's somewhere to go. You've got a killer running around. Who is he going to kill next?
Two weeks after Megan Sharpton was murdered, investigators are searching for a link to the unsolved disappearance of another nursing student in a nearby town a year earlier.
The Holly Bobo case became interest to us, and our investigators reached out to theirs. There was concern that we may be dealing with a serial killer.
While detectives from both cases work together to establish a link, rumors sweep through the community.
I was terrified to go out at night. I didn't like going places I wasn't familiar with, and I lived in fear almost of just everyone.
With Megan's killer still at large, the sense of loss begins to overwhelm her family.
I was really hoping that it would be solved pretty quickly because it was consuming Mom minute by minute. I could feel her emptiness when Megan passed away. She was never the same again.
It absolutely became a mission. I know if it had been my child, I would want somebody to have went that extra mile, to work that extra hour, to find the resolution to what had happened.
Finally, 3 weeks into the investigation, police get the results from the forensic search of Megan's vehicle.
It came back with no evidence. They didn't find anything that shouldn't have been there. There was nothing of value found.
Detectives hope tests on the DNA found inside Megan's body will yield better results. Her approximate time of death was before midnight, so investigators circle back to her boyfriend's alibi.
He said he was working at the time that happened.
Chris was working as a cashier on the evening shift. We go back and pull the video. He was in the store when Megan had been killed. This is not our guy.
Chris contacts police with a lead that sends the investigation in a new direction.
The original phone call about this job opportunity came into an older phone that Megan had.
Chris is able to locate the phone and shows it to detectives.
He was able to go back and find a number that he believed had called proposing this job.
When investigators run the phone number, they get a surprising result.
It was what we refer to as a burner phone.
The burner phone, the fake address, and the suspicious job opportunity all add up to what detectives suspected early on.
She was going to a fake job interview.
So if we could track that phone down, we could get to very possibly who the perpetrator was.
Because burner phones don't require a registered name, the number doesn't lead to anyone.
So I was able to at least track the phone to being sold at the department store here, and I called their loss prevention person. I was like, well, can you pull every one of these sales that was done?
There was like 11 or 12 burner phones purchased, and we pulled video.
We started looking at the males and the questionable ones, and just, you know, who looks like the most suspect person in these pictures.
One of the people paid for their phone, that burner phone, but they had their cell phone out on the camera. And just the demeanor and that just really caught Todd's attention.
It caught my attention big time. He's already got a cell phone. He's buying this burner phone for a reason. We were able to use the video from the department store to follow him from the purchase, out the door, into the parking lot. Almost off camera, we saw him approach a red pickup truck. Why would you park that far out unless you were trying to avoid detection? I take the pictures of this guy and I circulate it at other departments. Within minutes, I had an identification of who this was. This guy's name was Timothy Gifford.
Timmy Gifford is a local drug dealer, not the most honest person around.
I put the word out that I need to find Mr. Gifford. I felt like he was our guy or he was involved.
Officers soon track Timmy down and bring him to the station.
We set him down in the interview room. I show him, you know, the picture of him buying the phone.
We told him straight up, you're the killer, and we're going to have your DNA. And Timmy was, you know, he was stressed out.
He was like, you know, I'll tell you everything I know. I didn't do this. It wasn't me.
Timmy says he doesn't know Megan and denies speaking to her. When challenged about the burner phone, he tells police he bought it a month before the murder for someone else.
He's like, Donnie Jones. I was like, you gotta be kidding.
Donnie Jones was a police informant.
Donnie had been a bad boy for a long time. He had a very long rap sheet, thefts and drugs.
Donnie Jones had served time before, and he had been accused of rape before. That right there was a real turn in investigation.
At first, detectives struggled to see how someone like Donnie could even be connected to Megan.
We find out that Donnie was married to Naomi Jones. That was another nugget that was very interesting.
Detectives had already talked to Naomi earlier in the investigation. She told police she did know Megan, but she had never recommended her for a job.
Naomi was somebody that Megan went to school with. They would carpool with each other occasionally. And we found out that Naomi's husband, Donnie Jones, would drive them if the weather was bad. Naomi's connected to a male with a criminal history, and he knew Megan Sharpton. There was a lot of aha moments in this case, but that was, we're going somewhere. We've got something here.
Three weeks after the murder of Megan Sharpton, detectives are interviewing Timmy Gifford. He tells police he bought the burner phone for Donnie Jones and divulges important details about the red truck seen in the surveillance footage.
Timmy Gifford said that the truck was Donnie's and that a few days after the murder, he had replaced all the interior. And I was like, ooh, that's probably my murder vehicle right there.
The carpet has been replaced. It's been completely detailed. That is a clue. that you may be on the right track.
Timmy also tells police Donnie traded the truck to his brother a week after the murder.
Everything is pointing towards Donnie Jones. As quick as we could, we got the search warrant, and we took the truck directly to the TBI crime lab.
Investigators have zeroed in on Donnie as a suspect and quickly pay him a visit.
In his initial statement to me, it was something to the effect of, I hardly know that girl.
I ain't never had no contact with her.
But you knew of her?
Yeah, I did know of her. I don't know much about her. I knew of her. When's the last time you talked to Megan? I ain't never talked to her. No, I take it back. When my old lady was going to school, one day they both needed a ride.
Donnie is adamant he had nothing to do with Megan's death.
His alibi was he was home with the kids.
I'm with my kids all the time. That's all I can do. I got a 9-month-old and 7-year-old twin.
Without something concrete showing that he was home, his alibi didn't hold water. He could have left with the children, he could have left the children with somebody.
Detectives confront Donnie with Timmy's claims.
This guy said he gave you this phone, and this is the number, the last number to call her when she was alive. He said he gave a phone to me? Yeah. He ain't gave me no phone. I have nothing to hide. Y'all need to search my house. Y'all can do it now.
We searched the house. We didn't come up with a lot of evidence. There was very little to be found.
Donnie also consents to provide a DNA sample. While they wait on the results, detectives get the forensics back on the red truck.
The truck had been cleaned, almost sanitized. Even the interior parts that I gathered off the search warrant, they didn't come back with any evidentiary value.
Megan's family is briefed on the new developments.
I saw the video, surveillance of that person purchasing the burner cell phone. I saw somebody that none of us knew that had no association to Megan whatsoever. Todd had a name of the person who that burner cell phone was purchased for, and I just kind of shrugged my shoulders like, okay, who is this guy? Nothing made any sense to me.
4 weeks after Megan's murder, the crime lab sends investigators the results of the analysis on the DNA from Megan's autopsy.
We got a DNA hit.
And the hit come back, and it's Donnie Frank Jones.
A supervisor of mine called Donnie up, and he's like, hey, I need to meet with you.
Donnie comes down to the station where detectives confront him.
I said, did you and Megan Sharpton ever date? No. Did you and Megan Sharpton ever just hook up, one night stand, party or something? No. Were you and Megan Sharpton during this date, the date of the homicide? No. And then Todd asked, why would your DNA be inside of her? And it was just, his face went, just couldn't believe it.
He got very, very, very irate, mad. After he had a moment, Donnie said, I just had sex with her.
However, his initial statement of he had never been around her other than at one time kind of put him in a corner.
Detectives don't buy Donnie's story, but they'll need something more concrete to press charges.
All we can prove right now is he had sex with her.
That was a concern of the district attorney, is that, a consensual relationship could have left that evidence behind.
Investigators have no choice but to let Donnie go.
It was really frustrating for me.
I was in complete disbelief. It was infuriating that he said it was consensual, and so he was allowed to walk free as they put the pieces together.
Hoping to prove who was with Megan when she was murdered, detectives run a detailed search on 4 phones: Megan's, Donnie's, Timmy's, and the burner.
We asked for cell phone GPS analysis. They can take some technical data and plot it out on a map and show you to some certainty an area where a phone call was made. We're in kind of a waiting pattern, hoping for phone records for the silver bullet to kind of put this thing away.
The cell phone analysis will take weeks, but investigators get a chance to get Donnie off the streets when they discover a rifle in the trunk of his car.
Donnie's a convicted felon. A convicted felon cannot possess firearms.
Even though the rifle is determined not to be the murder weapon, it's enough to arrest Donnie. Now detectives must establish if he killed Megan Sharpton.
We got him in custody. We had the DNA, but at the same time, we needed more. We needed as much as we possibly could get.
It's all theoretical until you can prove he murdered her.
4 months after Megan's murder, investigators receive the detailed phone data and find a clear link between Megan and her killer.
And I was just ecstatic. Hell yeah.
I met with Kelly, and I told her in person, I know who killed your daughter.
Four months after the savage murder of Megan Sharpton, detectives have used cell phone GPS data to prove who killed the 24-year-old nursing student.
That's Donnie Jones.
On the night of the murder, the burner phone, I will refer to it as the murder phone, and Donnie's phone, they were in or about the same location. Timmy's phone is not involved. The murder phone and Megan's phone are talking to one another. And the cell phone records will show they were coming in contact with one another, and then they both stopped where her car was found. And I think at that time is when she was abducted. Using the cell phone data, we was able to show that at first that Donnie was close to the place where we believe she was abducted at. Then that he was close to the place I believe that he killed her at, and then that he was close to where the body was found.
Donnie's family owns several farms in that area, and that's where we felt like that she was murdered.
They gave us permission to search that area, and it's an extremely secluded place.
Investigators make a telling discovery.
There was a burn barrel there that caught my eye. I found a purple scarf with black stars on it. It was later identified by her sister, Carrie, as a gift that she had given Megan. I went from an absolute whodunit to this guy might have done it to, oh, this guy definitely done it.
The overwhelming evidence is what made the DA take that step to indict him.
I was elated. I went to the Coffee County Sheriff's Department and had him brought up, and I arrested him.
On November 5th, 2012, Donnie Jones is charged with first-degree murder, rape, and 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping.
One attorney, that was it. He had no more to say.
Never would I have thought it would wind up like this. When Donnie was charged, Mom, she was still pretty overwhelmed, but it was a relief to start learning that we were going to get the details of what events led up to that day.
Based on the evidence collected, investigators pieced together how Donnie lured and then murdered Megan. It paints a disturbing picture of a calculating predator.
So while looking into the murder phone, we started backtracking all the numbers that it had called. And there was a pattern. Everyone that was called with that phone was someone that was sitting with the elderly or doing some kind of nursing in-home service. The murder phone was used just seeking out a victim. Donnie had reached out to Megan. He knew well enough to go in his wife's phone and get her number out, and that's how all this started.
She had known Donnie and his wife, not close friends, but knew them. She answered that call from Donnie.
Megan was on her way to a job that didn't exist. The directions she had got were not good. She had to call our suspect.
He met her, at which time he abducted her and went back to one of the family's farms.
Megan Sharpson's last few minutes of life was pure hell and panic and fear.
He raped her and shot her. Megan was beaten prior to being killed. He moved her from there to where he set her body on fire to try to hide his crimes. And then he went home and acted like nothing happened.
Donnie Jones is just a cold-blooded killer, sexual deviant, cold-blooded killer.
7 months after Megan's murder, Donnie Jones pleads guilty, and on February 4th, 2013, he's sentenced to life without parole.
I feel like there will never be enough done to him. He's sick, he's a monster. There is no reasonable explanation why he did it.
There was a sense of accomplishment that we moved so fast in finding out who killed her. Had we not have caught him, he would have reoffended.
Detectives do determine Megan's murder was not connected to the Holly Bobo case.
There was 4 people arrested in the Holly Bobo case. It had nothing to do with my case.
If Megan hadn't lost her life, I feel very confident that Donnie Jones would still be out, trying to trick young women. Megan put him behind bars for life. She sacrificed her life to keep everybody else in our community safe.
Despite getting justice for Megan, the Sharpton family suffers another tragedy just 9 months later in November 2013.
Mom took her life 16 months after Megan's death. Her heart was just incredibly broken, and she made the choice. She wanted to be with Megan.
Yeah, he essentially killed them both. Sure did.
Our family time, that's when I missed her the most. I missed that laugh. If you just heard Meg's laugh, you would be having a much better day. I miss those specific moments, those milestones that she's not gonna get to be a part of.
I thought Megan and I would be friends for, on into adulthood. We were supposed to be together forever, as best friends, as sidekicks. She was not someone you could forget. There was a memorial placed on the side of the road where she was found, and it's this beautiful giant star sculpture. It's very cool, and Megan would absolutely love it.
A good-natured, fun-loving man.
He was just a wonderful person. He was so funny and so charming.
Enjoying his retirement years.
At that point in his life, he was very content. He was very close to his family, his nieces and nephews.
Is brutally gunned down a month before his wedding.
It was point-blank assassination.
There's a big puddle of blood. Oh my God!
Investigators pieced together a series of clues.
We had to look at what role that upcoming wedding had and what happened.
They'd have their arguments, they had their differences.
Was the scene staged to cover up an intentional killing? The investigation kept hitting dead end after dead end.
And chased down multiple suspects.
It was a whodunit. We were hoping for that break to come.
Revealing a plot fueled by greed.
He was somebody who had had a criminal history of theft and assault.
Just when police are close to making an arrest,
it was like he had just got smacked in the head with a baseball bat.
They uncover damning evidence pointing to a surprising suspect.
You never expect anything like this.
And then all of a sudden, the kill was right in front of us.
On a warm July afternoon in 2014, the sleepy Pittsburgh suburb of Kennedy Township is rocked by a panicked call to 911.
Okay, now what's going on?
I just come home from work and my husband, He's been on the ground. He's dead. There's a big puddle of blood.
Police, fire, and ambulance are coming, okay?
Oh, please help me. Oh, my God.
The woman who made the 911 call, Carol Apaya, says the victim is her soon-to-be husband, 59-year-old Jack Parks.
When I arrived on scene, the first thing I noticed is that the victim's head was covered in blood. It was on closer examination that you could see it was a gunshot wound. One challenge we had right out of the gate was that there was no casing for gun found. We don't move his body until it can be photographed. It was possible there was a gun underneath him that no one had seen, so we weren't 100% sure if the gunshot wound at that point had been self-inflicted or homicide. We looked for a while. Unfortunately, we didn't find any type of gun.
Detectives searched for any signs of what happened to Jack and who pulled the trigger.
It was pretty clear right off the bat that this was some type of a home invasion or robbery that occurred.
It didn't look like a struggle had ensued in the room, but once you walked through the victim's house, the further you got into it, the more you realized the level of disarray it was in. And as you went into the dining room, you started to see a jewelry box here, a drawer gone through here, papers rifled through. Upstairs, there was just complete disarray. The drawers were all pulled out. The clothing that was inside the drawers was strewn everywhere. Jewelry boxes flipped open, empty watch boxes laying there.
We were trying to determine, was the scene staged? Was someone just trying to make it look like a robbery or a burglary? And when in fact, they're just trying to cover up an intentional killing where they intended just to walk in and execute somebody. The house was dusted and processed for DNA and fingerprints. We then began to process the outside of the residence, looking for any type of forced entry, and none of that was found.
Our first thoughts were the victim either knew the actor or was familiar with him. That's just our first impression. So, who was friends with the victim, who would have access to the victim, who would have opportunity to the victim, and who would he trust?
It really was a shocking case. He was killed execution style. This homicide happened in an area that we don't normally have murders.
Jack's death is the first homicide in Kennedy Township in 10 years. The news stuns his family and friends.
When I got that phone call and I heard Carol's voice, I knew something was wrong. And she said, "Jack's gone." I said, "What do you mean, gone?" She said, "He's dead." And then she said he was murdered. And I just went into shock.
Jack Parks was born the second of 5 kids in Pittsburgh in 1955. Friends and family were everything to him.
Jack always made friends. He was one of the best people I've ever known. He would do anything for anybody. We first met in 1st grade. We hit it off all through high school. And after that, it was a good ride.
Jack was so well liked. He could be charming when he wanted to and funny. He was just a wonderful person.
In 1989, a chance encounter changed Jack's life.
Jack met Carol at the local bar, and I guess they hit it off.
They were 2 peas in a pod. Soon as he brought Carol, we fell in love with Carol.
Jack was very close to his family. He had about 9 nieces and nephews.
Jack and Carol used to have their nieces and nephews over for sleepovers, making the popcorn and just having a good time. You'd have swore that Jack and Carol were the parents. They didn't have kids, so when those kids were around, they were their kids.
Jack had recently retired, but had big plans for the future.
At that point in his life, Jack was very content. Him and Carol were going to get married.
They've been together for over 25 years. Carol in the beginning really wanted to get married, and Jack didn't. And then at one point, Jack wanted to get married, and Carol didn't. And I used to tell Jack, you know what, I like to be living when you get married, when you say I do. And then when they set the date, I was so happy. It was gonna be an exciting, very exciting day.
Tragically, Jack was murdered a month before the ceremony was to take place.
Her and Jack were going to be married on August 31st of that year, and it was really sad. It was so close.
At 5 p.m. on July 21st, 2 hours after Carol found Jack dead, police questioned her at the station.
Talking to Carol was so important because, first of all, we had to determine whether she was or wasn't involved, and we wanted to just get the best timeline from her. During the interview with Carol, she explained that she had left for work as usual, her normal time, about 5:40. She starts work at 6. Everything was fine when she left for work. It wasn't until a realtor called her about a potential buyer for Jack's late mother's home. And when the realtor couldn't get a hold of Jack, Carol started to worry. She tried to call Jack, and there was no answer.
So then she got concerned. He always called her back every time that she tried to get a hold of him. So I think it was approximately about 2 o'clock she left work and then come over and find Jack, of course.
Detectives know that spouses are always the first suspect and must determine if they can trust Carol's version of events.
We have a timeline between 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. when she returns home. In some cases, you know, if a person's a cold-blooded killer, they may have killed him before she left the house, and then all of a sudden she finds him, and, you know, and the killer's right in front of us.
Her demeanor, she was very upset, but you can't take a chance by skipping a stone and not trying to look at her.
Detectives are suspicious of why it took the couple so long to decide to get married, and if someone had cold feet.
Something that we thought is, are either one of them having affairs with someone else? Could that be a possible motivation, and is this upcoming wedding triggering that?
Coming up, detectives uncover a family feud.
They just decided to distance themselves and not let him come to the house.
And learn Jack's inner circle isn't as loving and devoted as it first seems.
Things got more contentious.
As police keep digging, more suspects surface.
We learned of several burglaries.
They had concerns about the employees. They hire criminals.
Just when the investigation is about to hit another dead end,
we had no idea who would have done this.
Detectives make a crucial discovery.
It was exactly what we needed.
When we got the phone records back, it was, oh my God.
That was an aha moment.
Kennedy Township Police are investigating the area's first homicide in a decade. 59-year-old Jack Parks was found dead in his home by his fiancée Carol in what appears to be a robbery. But since there was no forced entry, investigators try to determine if this was actually a staged attack, and if the motive was something more personal.
When we interviewed Carol, we had to look at what role, if any, that upcoming wedding had in what happened. We had to start looking at every aspect of their lifestyle. What were the family dynamics? We had to chip away at a number of things in their life, things that happened that day, but also things that might have happened in the past that could be a motivation for this murder.
They had their differences. They'd have their arguments, but it wasn't my point to get involved in their squabbles.
We kept talking more and more about any kind of problems that they had had in their home. And I asked her, do either of them have a gun? And she said that they did not.
Carol says she would never do anything to hurt the love of her life. She wanted to marry him. Jack was her soulmate.
Jack and Carol, they loved each other. They felt they were already married. To everybody, they were husband and wife years before, the wedding was planned.
Carol was very upset. It was very difficult to talk to her while she processed that emotion, but then to still get the information we needed to keep moving the investigation forward. To me, that was a sign that she wasn't involved.
With suspicion shifting from Carol for now, investigators explore whether theft was the main motive.
The bedroom was ransacked. The mattress was disturbed. Things were emptied out of drawers.
Carol had indicated to me some items that should be there. Their wedding rings that they had bought. Jack collected some coins. He had some expensive watches. She indicated that the watches should be in the boxes. When we first processed the areas of disarray, none of those items were there. That was our first big clue to go off of. I knew that if we could find that jewelry, we could find who was involved. We didn't know if the person who took it might have given it to someone else, but we had to start with where is it, who has it, and how did they get it.
The next morning, the autopsy report comes in.
He was taken out with one shot and to the right side of his head. It took it to a level where you know that is someone who probably came there with the intent to either use that weapon to intimidate or control Jack. There was a projectile that was recovered from his skull, and we were able to determine that we were looking for this .380.
So that was a good start for us. Now we knew what kind of gun we were looking for.
During the victim's autopsy, you could see that there were no wounds on his hands at all. There were no scratches, there were no broken fingernails, nothing that seemed to indicate that he had had a chance to fight back. He had been caught completely off guard.
During Carol's interview, she indicated to police that Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, is someone they should look into.
Bradley was living across the street with his mother and father, across the street from Jack. And he was always over there. And from what I understand, he was one of the last ones to see Jack alive.
We made contact with Bradley, and Bradley had told us that he had gone over to Jack's house on the 21st, and he said he got there around 10:30 in the morning.
Detectives find that timing suspicious. They know Jack was killed sometime between 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. that day.
I asked him, I said, Bradley, what did you go over there to talk to him about? And he said, well, Jack's mother had passed away, and he knew that Jack was looking to sell the home. But Bradley wanted to negotiate a deal with Jack, and he wanted to talk to Jack alone because he said, I don't want Carol weighing in on this. I want this to be a Parks family matter, and I want to discuss it with him. In his words, I didn't want her putting her 2 cents in. And that was a phrase that seemed to hint at some kind of animosity.
Bradley tells investigators that he finds Carol too controlling and that she shouldn't have a say in this family decision.
Jack wanted to wait until he could talk with Carol about it, which sort of defeated the purpose of why Bradley had gone there when she wasn't home. So he said he ended up leaving and they were going to revisit the conversation later.
As investigators press him further, Bradley reveals an alarming fact.
We did ask him about any firearms that he owned, and when Bradley told us he owned a .380 caliber pistol, it kind of was like, okay, this may be something broke bad, because now we know Carol leaves for work at 6 a.m. and Jack's alive at 10:30 because Brad's telling us he's over there.
He indicated he had left about 11:15. With Bradley's timeline, it definitely seemed that Bradley was very close in time to when Jack would have been killed. And he put himself there. He had the same type of gun.
Had the discussion about Jack's mother's house turned fatal?
With the timing of Bradley's conversation with Jack, it made me wonder whether things got more contentious than he was alluding to in my interview with him, or did he leave there upset, or did somebody else come back and do something to Jack? It had to be looked into.
12 hours after Jack Parks was found dead, investigators chased down leads around their latest person of interest, Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson.
When I found out that Bradley was a suspect, I was mad. I was really upset, knowing that they thought that. But then again, when it comes to an investigation, police are doing their job.
Bradley and Jack had a disagreement, and he admits to owning the same caliber gun.
So that definitely stepped up our interest in Bradley. This is a gun that we needed to take a look at.
Bradley's gun was collected, taken to the lab where it was test fired. The ballistics on the gun did not match the projectile that was recovered from Jack during the autopsy.
With nothing concrete linking Bradley to the murder, he is dropped as a suspect. Detectives also corroborate Carol's alibi.
On the day that this happened, we were able to verify that she was at work and she was accounted for at that time. We were able to eliminate Carol as a suspect.
Looking for new leads, detectives speak to the other nieces and nephews who were close to Jack.
During our interview of Carol, she had told us about her nephew, Michael LaPea, who was almost like a son to her, and he had been at the house a lot.
They got along good. Michael joined the military. Jack was very proud of Michael. Jack took pride in the nieces and nephews because he watched them grow up.
Michael was brought in to the homicide office and interviewed about Jack's murder. And during that interview, Michael had said that he was unemployed. He was trying to seek help through the VA hospital due to his PTSD from being in the Army. Michael had been discharged from the military due to his use of cannabis.
Michael also admits he'd fallen out with the family, including his aunt and uncle, and hadn't seen them in a year.
He specifically denied being over near the victim's house, and he made reference to them being estranged. Michael had a bit of a drug problem, and Carol and Jack decided to distance themselves from Michael and not let him come to the house.
Detectives still need to know where Michael was when Jack was killed.
We knew Carol left around 6 a.m. We knew that Bradley was there about 10:30. We knew Carol found him around 3 o'clock. So there's a window of opportunity of about 4 hours. He told us he was at home in Sharpsburg on the day of the incident, July 21st, 20 minutes away from Jack's house.
He said that his girlfriend had kind of unexpectedly taken the day off and they spent the day together. Nothing out of the ordinary. He gave us some landmarks on our timeline that we could check out. Michael and his girlfriend Melanie had gone and done some shopping in the town that they lived in. He said that he had had a doctor's appointment at the VA hospital later that afternoon. These were things at businesses and locations that we could check from doing surveillance video or getting sales transactions. Michael's girlfriend Melanie did corroborate his activities, and she stated they had spent the day together.
It was determined that his alibi had checked out.
A day into the investigation, with Jack's closest circle cleared, investigators escalate the search for the missing jewelry.
We were physically going to many pawn shops to try to see if anybody had sold this jewelry. We didn't get any traction with that.
That's when we started doing a canvass of the neighborhood.
When we were doing our neighborhood canvass, so many people had mentioned near their house there's a meat factory, and they had concerns about the employees. We had heard things like they hire people with records, they hire criminals. From talking to Carol, she said they have a straight view into Carol and Jack's home, and Jack had mentioned sometimes he would let people use his phone or use the bathroom when they were on their break, and it upset her.
In a case like this, you may see, hey, look at this guy, he got some gold on. It's a crime of opportunity.
We knew that they got their morning break right around the time when people stopped hearing from Jack, so we definitely wanted to look into that and see what the consensus was over there.
I think we did like almost 40 interviews of all the employees to see who they were.
One worker in particular piques police interest.
Ronald Blevins was a name that came up from multiple employees in the context of people who had gone over to Jack's. This may be the person that Carol was aware that had come over there. Ronald Blevins was somebody who had had a criminal history of petty theft and assault, so he was on our radar for sure.
Investigators worked quickly to bring Ronald in for an interview.
Ronald indicated that he had known Jack and they were actually friendly, and that's why he was allowed to come into the house when Carol wasn't home. Carol said she would get upset with Jack. She would say, "Jack, don't just let anyone in our house. You can't do that." And he would just, kind of shrug it off. But she just didn't want people coming into the house that she didn't know.
Investigators asked Ronald point blank if he had anything to do with Jack's murder.
He said he had no involvement in Jack's death. The day that Jack was killed, Ronald didn't come to work. He had actually taken scheduled vacation for Friday and Monday. Ronald Blevins' alibi checked out, and we were able to eliminate him as a suspect in this case.
Desperate for a new lead, investigators look for similarities with other robberies in the area.
After Jack's murder, we talked to the local authorities, and during that, we learned of several burglaries, one of which an older lady was burglarized, and about $5,000 worth of quarters were taken.
Jack's killer had stolen his coins as well as jewelry. Is this the same person? And could they strike again?
The neighbors were very afraid. We still have a killer out there.
It was a whodunit. Once something like this happened, you think that anything's possible now.
Police investigating the cold-blooded shooting of Jack Parks suspect his murder could be linked to another recent robbery in the neighborhood.
We learned that during that burglary, there were some items similar to what Jack had that were taken, and it was a burglary that happened during the day, which is the timeline we were looking at in this particular incident. Oftentimes in our investigations, we see that residential burglaries are done during the day in bedroom communities where the chance of the people inside the home being at work are better, and that way they can go in and they can take what they need without fear of being caught.
With Jack being retired and home all day, had he caught the burglar red-handed and paid the ultimate price? The neighboring police department already has a suspect in custody.
Vernon Zielinski was identified as a possible suspect in this case. He had been recently arrested.
The items that Vernon was accused of taking were coins. Well, Jack had coins that were missing. So Vernon Zielinski was tracked down and he was interviewed. We really just wanted to do an interview and determine what connection, if any, he had to Jack. During the interview, he said that he had been arrested for the burglary, but that burglary was at an old employer's house. He denied knowing Jack, and he said that the day that this happened, he was actually at work.
We confirmed that through his new employer, that he was working that day, during the time frame that this would have occurred.
Vernon was somebody we were absolutely able to rule out of being directly involved. At that stage in the investigation, we had no idea who might have done this and why.
48 hours after Jack's murder, with no arrests in the case, fear is growing in Kennedy Township.
Everyone was concerned that how in broad daylight can someone walk into a house, kill somebody, and walk out without even being seen.
The hardest thing to comprehend was the murder. It was point-blank assassination. Stone-cold killing. You never expect anything like this. I know I didn't.
Waiting for an arrest, you're still in that daze of trying to process it all. He's not coming back. It's just too unbelievable. Is this gonna be another murder unsolved?
We had a lot of information to go on, and we were constantly moving the investigation forward. People were being eliminated, Further suspects were being developed.
3 days after Jack was discovered dead, police get a major break.
A local pawn shop in Sharpsburg, PA, which is another small little borough within Allegheny County, the owner had called the local police due to some suspicious activity. On the day of the incident, July 21st, he said a gentleman came in with a cachet of gold and was trying to sell it to him.
What the employee found to be concerning was, first of all, the jewelry was manipulated. It was very distinguishable pieces, but they had been, it seemed to be hammered or just manipulated in a way that would make them hard for law enforcement to identify. It threw up a red flag to him, but also he seemed to think that this was a person who had sold him stolen jewelry in the past. So he didn't buy the jewelry, but he also had the foresight to know he wanted to see where this jewelry might have come from. He knew it was important to get a picture of it. So he took a photograph of the items that this person was trying to sell.
He provided us with the photographs, and they were taken to Carol, who viewed them.
She became very upset. She started crying, and she said, "That's our jewelry."
It felt like we were closing in. Based upon the photograph of the jewelry, we were able to get that out to the local department. They could share it with the pawn shop owners in town if anyone comes in with this.
Investigators hope they can identify the seller.
The pawn shop owner was able to give a good description of the person who brought the jewelry in. A younger white male, black hair, and thin build. That description was provided to the local police chief in Sharpsburg, and he thought that fit the description of a white male from that area. It gave us a very good lead in this case. A photo array was put together to include 8 individual photographs, and they were shown to the shop owner.
We have a set of instructions that we give them, and we say, the person that we're looking for may or may not be in here, but if you see the person indicated on the lineup. So once he reviewed the photo array, he did identify who that person was. It was a huge break. It was exactly what we needed.
Coming up, police find stunning evidence pointing to Jack's killer.
In the video, we knew exactly who it was.
This was a shock to everyone.
You never thought that would happen. It would be that person.
But making an arrest wouldn't be easy.
She provided alibis for him and just denials.
Until investigators find proof no one can deny.
Those records don't lie.
Detectives have just identified the man who tried to pawn murder victim Jack Park's jewelry. His name? Brian Gibbons.
He's been a known thief to the local police department. We went after that lead strong.
We were feeling pretty confident that Mr. Gibbons may be our man, or at least know who our man was. We were very excited and very motivated to go find him.
Brian has a long history of petty crimes, but investigators need to determine if he's a killer. 4 days after the murder, they get a warrant to search his home.
Specifically, we were looking for any of the very distinguishing items that Jack Parks had. Unfortunately, we didn't find any of the victim's jewelry in the house, but we did find some items that did turn out to be stolen from someone else.
Based upon the search at Mr. Gibbons' residence, we were able to arrest him and have him sent to the county jail.
Investigators question Brian about Jack's missing jewelry.
He said that he didn't have anything to do with it. At that point, we were trying to determine if perhaps he'd been given some jewelry to sell, that maybe he didn't know its origin and he went to go sell it. We really just wanted to see if we could come up with any connection to rule him either in or out on the homicide of Jack Parks.
Brian tells detectives he doesn't know the victim and has never been to his home.
He said he had no connection to Jack at all. He denied having any knowledge of the Jack Parks homicide. We asked, well, what's your alibi? And he goes, I was arrested for entering an abandoned house that day. And that was confirmed. Brian was not the killer. He had a solid alibi.
It was clear that he was not the same individual who had come in to the store on that Monday that tried to sell the jewelry.
The pawn shop owner mistakenly identified the wrong person.
The investigation kept hitting dead end after dead end.
We thought we had it, but then once we eliminated him, we took a pause. We had to step back a minute, not start all over, but then keep everything else in perspective.
While detectives hunt for new leads, Jack's loved ones struggle with their grief. Instead of looking forward to Jack's wedding, 5 days after his murder, they attend his funeral.
When he told me he was going to get married, his brother and I would have stood up for him. I was proud because I was never a best man. And there I was, carrying his casket. God, to have something like that happen in such a quick time, it's devastating to everybody.
You feel the hurt, but it really doesn't sink in until the funeral's all over. And then the shock is over. It's reality. He's gone.
Fearing the case could go cold, a week after the murder, police step up the hunt for Jack's stolen jewelry, hoping the culprit is still attempting to sell it at a pawn shop.
We all just sort of fanned out, and we took particular geographical areas. We knew there was still a person that was out there trying to sell Jack's jewelry, and we had to just keep holding out hope that the pawn shop would take their identification, that they would keep good records. That's what kept us going, honestly. There is a detective in the city of Pittsburgh who is a pawn shop records analyst, and I reached out to her and I told her what items that we had missing, and on August 4th I heard back from her, and she told me that she had found the jewelry where it had been sold.
Investigators race to the pawn shop.
We had to go take a physical look at it, see who, if anybody, was on camera. Some store policies, all they have to do is take an individual's driver's license number. They don't even have to make a photocopy of it. So we were trying to remain optimistic that somehow we would get an image of the actual person who tried to sell that jewelry. It could have been anyone at that point.
The pawn shop has surveillance video, and what detectives see on tape is jaw-dropping.
It was, oh my God.
We knew exactly who it was. In the video, it was Michael Apaya, which was Carol's nephew that Jack raised like one of his own.
This was a shock to everyone.
When we first had dealings with Michael, early on in the investigation, he did provide an alibi about businesses he was at, doctor's appointments.
Michael had his girlfriend Melanie saying that he was with her during the time that Jack would have or could have been killed. So it was kind of going back, trying to retrace what he had initially told us.
We still had to do a little bit more digging. We had to work on if we were missing something. Early on, when we talked to Michael, he had given detectives his phone number. I wanted to get his phone records.
While investigators wait for those records, they call Michael back in.
We are going to interview him and see what he has to say now that we have him on tape pawning his uncle's jewelry.
We decided that it would probably be ideal to bring Michael and his girlfriend Melanie in at the same time, being that she was the person who was providing an alibi for him, and chip away at that and see where the truth lied. We took them both back to our office and they were interviewed in separate rooms. Michael, in his interview, was initially very adamant that he had nothing to do with this. He denied involvement with the murder, involvement with the jewelry, and he just would not deviate from that.
Melanie stands by her story too.
She provided alibis for him and just denials.
Melanie is pretty much telling us that he was with her during the time that Jack would have or could have been killed.
She was just defensive and trying to argue with what we knew was not true. and that was that he had sold Jack's jewelry. We showed her a picture of the jewelry, and she tried to say it was hers. And we knew that was a lie.
With neither Michael nor Melanie cracking under the pressure, detectives need something to break the deadlock.
When we got the information about the cell phone records, it was a huge break. We were very happy that it finally had come through. It was like everything came full circle.
Two weeks after Jack Parks was shot to death in his own home, investigators get the break in the case they needed: incriminating cell phone GPS data.
When I got Michael's phone records, I started to see where generally he spent most of his time, which was consistent with his home.
He told us he was in Sharpsburg, 20 minutes away from Jack's house, on the day of the incident.
Parts of his alibi checked out, cell phone data-wise, but there was an anomaly where about 11:45, his cell phone pinged over in the area of Jack and Carol's house. To me, the significance of 11:45 was it is in this time where Carol can't reach Jack.
It would be impossible to be in Sharpsburg and your phone ping off a tower in Kennedy Township. The amount of distance between the two, it wouldn't be possible. He was not at home. He was over near his uncle's house.
So 11:45, Michael's phone being over there was an aha moment. Those records don't lie.
Detectives want to see how Michael will react when confronted with his own cell phone records.
It was like he had just got smacked in the head with a baseball bat. He became very quiet, took a second, and he just let it all out.
I was suffering from PTSD, and the morning of July 21st, I asked Mel to take a ride with me. She just drove down with me and I parked her car. I told her to wait. She never got out of the car. She had no clue where we were going.
Michael's explanation of why he went to see Jack only raises more suspicion.
About a year ago, I was accused of stealing jewelry, and I wanted to make amends. I wanted to fix it. I knocked on a door to apologize and talk. At that time, he became hostile, and he choked me and swung at me.
His story changed to self-defense.
He had two hands around my neck, and at that time, I felt my life was threatened, and I had a pistol 380 on me. It went off.
Reconciling that just wasn't possible. Jack was shot one time right close to his ear. Basically, someone held a gun to his head and executed him.
He fell to the floor, and I panicked. Ren grabbed jewelry, and I left.
Michael tells detectives he sold the jewelry for $1,000. Even more shocking is what he spent the money on.
You stated that that's one of the people you sometimes purchase narcotics from.
Yes. I gave him about $600 to $700.
In addition to that, several days later, what did he give you?
He gave me heroin.
Michael was following a path of substance abuse that was getting to be more addictive drugs, and his use was increasing. It wasn't recreational anymore. It was more the behavior of an addict.
It was heartbreaking for us to know that someone who was almost like Jack's son, a very close family member, would do something like that in exchange for a couple of dollars to get high.
I believe Michael went to that house to take jewelry. He knew Jack was there, and the only way he was going to get that jewelry is if Jack was dead. He walked up to the house, and as soon as Jack met him at the door and turned his back to him, he shot him, and he fell, and he died instantly.
On August 5th, 2014, Michael LaPaya is charged with first-degree murder.
To say to Carol, we know who did this, it was hard, but the hardest answer that we had for her is when she said, Michael who? And he had the same last name as her, really. It was hard to tell her that, it's your nephew. And it just hit her, and she was very upset.
You never thought that would happen. it would be that person.
It's still to this day so hard to believe that somebody that they loved, Michael, could have done something like this. I mean, what he did, I can't describe. There's no words.
At trial, Michael is found guilty. On December 9th, 2015, the 24-year-old is sentenced to life in prison.
He took a loving, caring man and just executed him. There was no winners. We lost Jack. Who won? Nobody.
I would never forgive him. Michael took away my best friend, my brother. He took away a lot from me. To this day, I still hate the guy.
Jack will never be forgotten. In the beginning, it's hard talking about a loved one without really breaking down crying. But you continue to talk about him. You keep their memory alive. And that's how he stays with us.
Every day, he's here in my mind, my heart, and my dreams. I see his face, always smiling. I know he's flying with the angels.
A single mother with a big heart.
If you needed anything, she was always there.
She was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
Is the victim of a bizarre murder.
Duct tape had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
Leaving her young son as the only witness.
A 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away, his mother being killed.
Investigators focus on the men in her life.
This guy, he wouldn't look at us. He was more nervous than normal.
And that polygraph test, he passed. It was frustrating as hell.
She was using Norma's house for these sexual liaisons.
To unveil a killer hiding in plain sight.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch.
People didn't see that inner demon. He was an unexpected killer.
It just blows you away.
Port Hueneme, California, a peaceful beach town on the Pacific coast.
It's a hidden gem. Port Hueneme is about 60 miles north of LA. It's a completely different environment. It's a lot more relaxed.
It's a quiet town, and it's a town that has, for a long time, a ridiculously low crime rate and very rarely a homicide.
But the tranquility of the seaside community is shattered one summer morning when police get an urgent call.
On June 1st, 1993, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, our dispatch received a call of a possible homicide.
An ex-husband had called up and said that his ex-wife had been murdered.
We hadn't had a homicide in over 3 years. It took me a second to realize, okay, this is real.
Detectives arrive to begin the investigation, but nothing can prepare them for the scene inside.
I got inside the house, and then it was like, oh my God. This is just too bizarre for words. She's laying on the floor, head encased in duct tape. It had been partially cut away, but it appeared as though someone had tried to wrap her like a mummy.
It went from the top of her forehead to the chin.
It was just incredibly strange. This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
And some rigor mortis had set in the back portion of her body because she was laying on the back. Usually rigor mortis takes a number of hours to show up. We estimated that the victim probably died in the early morning hours When I saw that duct tape, the first thing that entered my mind was this was somebody she knew. Whoever did it didn't want to have her look at them while they were committing the crime.
Looking to unravel the mystery of this bizarre murder, detectives turn to the victim's ex-husband, who claims to have discovered the body.
At the house, the ex-husband was there, his brother was there, and 2 younger sons were there.
The ex-husband, Tony, identifies the victim as 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez, mother to 2 boys, Andrew, 11 years old, and Austin, 4 years old.
Tony, he said that he had come over to the house to pick up the kids to take them to school, which was his regular practice.
The 2 boys were still asleep in their beds when Tony realized what had happened to their mother. He told them to stay in their room until police arrived.
Tony, his brother Hector, and the 2 sons were transported to the Port Hueneme Police Department, where they were going to be interviewed separately. Tony and Hector were first at the house, and we needed to determine what happened.
Police continue to comb through the house looking for clues.
It was not a scene of extreme violence. There wasn't blood anywhere. There weren't a lot of things overturned.
In the bedroom, we located her purse, and it was intact. There wasn't anything that seemed to be missing.
This was not like a burglary that had gone wrong.
There's no sign of forced entry into the home. Then, something else catches the detective's eye.
I noticed a set of keys that were on the floor. They were in an unusual location, close to her body. We checked and confirmed they were Norma's house keys.
But why were Norma's keys lying next to her body? As investigators finish processing the scene, Norma's sister, Aralia, arrives.
I was supposed to pick her up because we were going to go looking for a car for her. And I had been calling her. And I drove to her house. That's when I saw the yellow tape. I saw the police department there, and that's what they told me would happen. And my worst nightmares, did I ever think that this would happen to my sister? It is horrible, horrible.
Norma Rodriguez was born and raised in rural Texas.
We're 7 sisters and 1 brother. She was the middle child, and, I was really close to Norma. She was very quiet, very reserved, a very big heart. If you needed anything, she was always there.
I first met Norma in 1975 in junior high school. We were 14 years old, and we became friends right away. Well, we used to hang out together and just go everywhere together. She could be feisty, but she was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
After high school, Norma moved to Oxnard, California for college and soon fell for another student named Tony.
She loved him. She just loved being with him.
Their college romance became more serious, and 2 years later in 1982, Tony popped the question. They soon had their first son, Andrew, and their second son, Austin, arrived 7 years later.
She was just a great mom. Norma was very devoted to her boys. Her boys were her life.
But in 1991, after almost 10 years together, Tony and Norma's marriage became strained.
Tony was really never around.
She was getting into arguments and fights with Tony, asking him to provide for them. She realized it would be an easier life for her if she just went on her own without Tony. And that's what she did.
Later that year, Norma moved with her sons to the neighboring town of Port Hueneme. She got a job at a local retail store and started a new chapter in her life.
Being a single mom, people might think that's a hard job. She enjoyed it. And it was hard for her, but she was happy.
Who would want to take the life of this loving mother, and in such a bizarre way? Later that day, at police headquarters,
detectives begin to interview Norma's ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez, and his brother, Hector.
As the first two parties to the scene, the investigators had to look at them.
The detectives asked Tony about how he found Norma earlier that day.
Tony, he said that he had knocked on the door, but Norma didn't answer. Sons Andrew and Austin were asleep. The door was locked, so then he used a credit card in order to slip the lock, and he was able to open the front door.
When Tony and Hector entered the living room, they saw Norma lying on the floor, her face wrapped in duct tape.
Hector told us that he cut the tape because they didn't know whether she was deceased or not, and they wanted to try to make it easier for her to breathe. He's the one that had the scissors in his possession, and he's the one that decided to cut the tape off of her face.
We thought, wow, that's a little strange. Why is this guy doing this? Why is he messing up our evidence? You know, Hector told us that the body was still somewhat warm. And that didn't make sense because by that time she had full rigor mortis. I mean, she had obviously been deceased for a number of hours. I just wasn't buying it.
Investigators are skeptical. Is Hector misleading police because the two men have something to hide? They hone in on Tony and Hector as possible suspects.
We don't know these people. We don't know what they're capable of.
Tony and Hector are suspicious. And Tony, being Norma's ex, he was right at the top of our list.
Coming up, detectives broaden their hunt for a possible killer.
We've got countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, interviews with co-workers.
We didn't know who it was. I just wanted him off the streets.
Investigators suspect a love interest from Norma's past has something to hide.
It was a brief but intense relationship.
It was that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life.
And what police uncover shocks everyone.
All this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
Mother of two, Norma Rodriguez, has been found murdered with her head wrapped in duct tape. Less than 24 hours into the investigation, detectives are interviewing their first suspect, starting with her ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez.
In a case like this, statistics will show you that an overwhelming amount of the time, it's going to be that significant other or former significant other who ends up being your suspect.
Investigators ask Tony about his relationship with Norma in the weeks leading up to her death.
At the time, Tony said that they had been separated for a couple of years. I don't believe they had filed for divorce yet, but they were living separately, and Tony had visitation rights. They weren't close friends anymore, but they tried to maintain the friendship for the boys.
But police have a different account from Norma's family.
We learned that shortly before the homicide, there were some conflicts.
Norma, she was upset at the fact that he would come make excuses to come over with the boys, but he would end up wanting to stay there. She used to complain about that. I said, don't let him in. He doesn't have the right to come into your house. And she was a little timid when it came down to Tony.
According to loved ones, Tony couldn't accept that Norma was moving on. Detectives press him about his whereabouts in the hours surrounding Norma's murder.
Tony said that on May the 30th, early afternoon, he talked with Norma and asked if their son Andrew could stay with him. Tony had tickets to an Angels game the next day, and so they agreed that that was okay.
Tony says Andrew was dropped back home the next night. At the time, Tony never entered the house. He found Norma's body the next day. Did Norma's ex innocently walk into the crime scene that morning, or had something more sinister happened?
The potential motive with him was he wanted the kids. Maybe one thing led to another, and he lost control.
In a room nearby, police questioned Tony's brother, Hector, since he was with him when Norma's body was found. They ask where he and Tony went after dropping Norma's son at his mom's.
Hector, he said that they had been at his residence with other family members in the city of Oxnard. And when we interviewed those family members, they corroborated what Tony and Hector told us.
Knowing their alibis are far from concrete, detectives asked Tony and Hector to take polygraph tests.
The results of the tests were that they were being honest in stating that they did not know anything about the homicide.
With no hard evidence to hold them, investigators are forced to let the two men go. News of Norma's death quickly spreads through the small community.
When I found out about her being murdered like that, I had told my cousin that I had just talked to her. It can't be true because I just talked to her. It was true.
At the police station, detectives received the results of the autopsy.
The cause of death was established as manual strangulation. Norma wasn't a tiny woman. Whoever did this had to possess significant upper body strength.
Some important details emerge about the duct tape.
The length of it was approximately 20 feet and had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
The duct tape was examined and there were skin cells that were discovered. But in 1993, DNA technology was in its infancy. You had to have a fairly significant sample size in order to potentially get a result from it. In Norma's case, they didn't have nearly enough in these samples.
To find out who did this, we have to dig deeper.
Searching for new leads, detectives hope Norma's 11-year-old son, Andrew, can help. With Tony's consent, the detectives talk with him at the station.
When you're interviewing any type of a witness, it's a difficult process. And you have to understand that when you're interviewing a child, it's extremely difficult. We interviewed Andrew, and we just wanted to try to get as much information as we could. From the date of the homicide, Andrew had gone to a baseball game with his father and his uncle. Later at night, Andrew was dropped off at the house, and the house was dark.
Andrew walked up to the front door, found it was locked. He went around to his bedroom, saw that the window was open, and crawled in.
Then, Andrew shares a disturbing detail told to him by his younger brother.
When Andrew came into the bedroom, 4-year-old Austin had said, "Mommy has a Band-Aid on her face." That didn't register immediately with Andrew, and so he went to bed. And it wasn't until morning that Andrew found out exactly what Austin meant by a Band-Aid. It just ripped at your heart knowing that a 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away from his mother being killed. And at one point he had come out, he had seen his mother's body. That just ripped at me a lot.
What else had Norma's youngest son, Austin, seen? Detectives decide to speak to the 4-year-old.
At first he was withdrawn. He really didn't want to talk about it, which was understandable. I knew that because he's 4 years old, and I couldn't have gone on much longer than I did. And I knew that I needed to stop. But then he mentioned a man by the name of Corey.
He brought up the name Corey as someone who was over at the house at that time. Now we've got this person who might end up being our prime suspect.
But who was Corey? Had he killed Norma? Did the single mom's youngest son just solve her murder?
We've got to run it down as far as it goes.
Police are investigating the bizarre murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez. Her youngest son, Austin, says he saw a man named Corey at their home around the time of the murder.
At that time, we had no idea who Corey was, but it was something that had to be checked out.
Detectives learn from the family that Corey could be Corey Davis, one of Norma's co-workers. So they head to her workplace.
First step was find out, to what extent Corey knew Norma, if they socialized, if they were friends away from work, and so forth.
Corey was more nervous than normal. In talking with him, he wouldn't look at us. He kept staring down, not tuning in or paying attention.
Corey's unusual behavior during their conversation alarms investigators.
He did not like being talked to and having to answer anything.
They questioned Corey about his relationship with Norma.
He stated that he would interact with Norma at work, but they weren't that close with each other, and they didn't have any interactions beyond that.
Detectives want to know if he was at Norma's house near the time of her murder, as young Austin claimed.
He made it pretty clear that he wasn't at the house at that time. Instead, he said the night of the homicide he was at home. The only people who were there at home with him were his parents. We needed to find out how much of what he was telling us was, provably true.
While officers are sent to check Corey's alibi, detectives speak to Norma's other coworkers, starting with her friend, Beatrice.
Beatrice came to Norma's house on Sunday, the day before the homicide. Norma had a get-together, a small barbecue at her house for several of her co-workers.
Police ask Beatrice if she remembers anything unusual about the day of the barbecue.
Beatrice said that while she was there, suddenly Norma can't find her keys anymore. And they ended up searching all over Norma's house, trying to figure out what happened to Norma's keys.
They didn't find them, and then they're laying beside her body, beside her house at the time she's found. We figured someone had taken her keys, and that's how they were able to enter the house.
It's a significant lead. Does this mean the killer stole the keys at Norma's barbecue? Detectives renew their focus on her inner circle.
From everything we knew, this was a pretty personal crime. We had a certain confidence that the killer knew Norma.
At the police station, investigators discover information they received from Corey Davis has some holes.
One of the things we do with everyone is we find out what their addresses are, their date of birth, everything else. And with Corey Davis, one of the things we noticed was that his address he gave us was not the address where he was actually living. So there was a discrepancy there.
Why would Corey withhold that information from detectives? They wonder what else he's hiding.
But at this point in time, Corey jumped out at us as this is the one we need to concentrate on.
Police bring Corey in for an interview, but he's far from helpful.
He's like, well, I don't want to be involved in this. Well, I understand that, but like it or not, you are part of this case. If you want to be eliminated from the suspect pool, the best way to do that is to cooperate with us.
Detectives share details of the crime with Corey to observe his reaction.
With the information that we were giving to him, he was obviously upset, and he took it really hard.
Corey denies any involvement in Norma's death. They ask him to take a polygraph test.
He submitted to the test, and he passed.
All detectives have tying Corey to the crime scene is a statement from Norma's 4-year-old son. But police know he could be mistaken, given his young age and traumatic experience.
At that point, Corey worked his way down the ladder of possible suspects dramatically.
1 week into the investigation, detectives are out of leads. They look at who else was at Norma's barbecue the day before she was killed. Friends tell them about a former coworker named Warren Mackey.
Warren Mackey was a previous co-worker of Norma's, and also he lived in fairly close proximity to her.
Warren and Norma hit it off and became friends.
They worked together for a while, and the work relationship became a social relationship. It appeared that Warren had something more than just a friendship interest in Norma.
I remember Norma telling me that there was a guy there that she used to work with, and he was always trying to talk to her and trying to ask her out.
Talking to Norma's coworkers, detectives learned that Warren pursued Norma, but she wasn't interested in him romantically.
Norma told Beatrice and some of the other people that she felt that Warren wanted more than to be friends, and that she wasn't interested in that. She tried to curtail any attempts that he may have made to ask her out. Some of the employees that we talked with felt that Warren wasn't real pleased with that. He liked Norma, and that he wanted the relationship a little bit more than what it was.
But Norma still tried to maintain their friendship.
She noticed he was kind of like an outcast, just very private. So she tried to include him in the group. She didn't want to leave him out.
As detectives look closer at the quiet coworker, the information they uncover is concerning.
Started picking up little details about him at that point. There were some people who said, yeah, good guy, he was okay to work with. But there were enough people who pointed out that he was a little weird and had made some overtures to Norma, enough to make us want to look into this a little further.
But did Warren's workplace crush make him a killer?
The nature of the relationship was of interest to us. We're going to have a conversation with Warren Mackey.
Police investigating the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez are questioning her former coworker, Warren Mackey. Detectives have learned that Warren may have been more than a doting colleague. They're trying to determine if he's connected to this brutal crime.
In our first encounter with Warren Mackey, there was nothing that seemed overtly suspicious or evasive or anything about him.
Detectives ask Warren about his feelings for Norma.
The impression that Warren Mackey gave us was that, his relationship with Norma Rodriguez was pretty casual. They didn't see quite as much of each other because they were no longer working with each other, but they socialized a lot.
Warren said that they were close, but it was only a close friendship. He never had romantic feelings for Norma.
He had tried to present himself to Norma as someone to lean on, someone to talk to. I'm here for you.
But investigators aren't fully buying it.
We felt that Warren liked Norma and that he wanted to make the relationship closer than it already was.
Then, Warren reveals a detail that grabs investigators' attention.
He had helped out Norma with, a couple little things around the house. And one of the things that he mentioned was that the kids had a small basketball hoop and it had somehow gotten broken and that he had fixed it. And what really kind of set off an alarm was the fact that he had fixed it with duct tape.
This is the first time in the investigation that anybody's mentioned duct tape or someone possessing duct tape.
Detectives drilled down on when Warren last saw Norma.
Warren said that he had been in the presence of Norma at the barbecue the day before the homicide. By the time things had wrapped up for the evening, it was essentially just him and Norma there, and they had just kicked back and watched TV for a while. This made him one of the last people who could have or would have seen Norma alive.
Had the former coworker made advances on Norma, then attacked her when she turned him down? Detectives ask where Warren was on the night of the murder.
Warren said that on May the 31st, close to Norma's homicide, he and his roommate and his roommate's girlfriend, they went to a nightclub in Santa Barbara till about 1:30, and then they came back to where they were living at in Oxnard. They talked for a short while, and then everybody went to bed. We drove to Oxnard, and we ended up talking with his roommate and her girlfriend who had gone with him for the night, and they corroborated his story as far as them going to Santa Barbara, closing the nightclub, and then getting back probably between 1:30 and 2 in the morning.
Could Warren have had time to drive to Port Hueneme and kill Norma after arriving home from a late night out with friends? Warren agrees to take a polygraph.
And he passed it, stating that he knew nothing about the homicide and he knew no one who would have killed her.
With nothing concrete tying him to the crime, police let Warren go. But before he leaves, Warren remembers Norma had problems with a man she was dating almost a year ago, named Daniel Garcia.
As the investigation continued, we started interviewing a number of people about Daniel. We found out that Daniel Garcia was Norma's boyfriend for a short period of time.
They met at a party. Norma had a strong attraction to the charming mechanic.
It was a brief but intense relationship, lasted a few months.
She told me about Daniel, that she really cared about him a lot. You know, they would do fun things together, and she always had a good time with him.
Friends tell police Daniel ended the relationship, blindsiding Norma.
Daniel had approached Norma and essentially told her that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. But Norma was affected quite a bit by the breakup.
Then, detectives learned that the relationship was turbulent.
There was some fraying in the relationship, and there were some conflicts. Now, that sends up some big red flags. There was one coworker who mentioned that they had witnessed a fairly heated argument between Norma and Daniel.
Daniel came in while she was working. For whatever reason it started, they had a verbal altercation that was witnessed by other people. It shows there was hostile feelings on the part of Daniel Garcia.
When detectives dig deeper into Daniel and Norma's relationship, they learn he visited Norma at home about 2 weeks before her murder.
Norma confided to her close friend she was involved with him before her death.
With a history of conflict in the relationship, did an argument turn deadly?
This is big. Any big fight that went on, that was problematic.
Detectives are closing in on their new suspect.
This could be our guy. We have to find out if he could have committed this crime.
The investigation into the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez is heating up. Police have a new suspect in their sights, an ex-boyfriend, Daniel Garcia.
One of the things that we learned about the relationship between Daniel and Norma was that there were some conflicts. That sends up some red flags.
Daniel agrees to come to the police station for questioning.
Norma really had no confrontations. She was very mild-mannered. The fact that she was getting into verbal altercations was unusual.
When detectives ask Daniel about his relationship with Norma, he denies any problems.
Daniel said that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. And so they broke up and went their separate ways. But they were still able to be somewhat friends, and he would stop by on occasion.
Detectives confront him about the heated argument with Norma at her workplace almost a year earlier.
At the time, Norma learned that he had had other relationships, and it was a problem. She was pretty upset by that.
She still had feelings for Daniel.
Had Norma attempted to restart their relationship, but instead wound up in a fight that spiraled out of control?
During his interview, Daniel told us that he saw Norma but didn't have an argument.
Detectives asked Daniel where he was the night Norma was killed.
He stated that he was at home with other family members watching TV, and then he went to bed. We talked with other family members, and that alibi was corroborated, but family members will lie for other family members. Sometimes they won't be perfectly honest with what they know, and it's extremely difficult to put weight on that.
Like previous suspects, Daniel is subjected to a polygraph.
And he passed.
With no evidence connecting the ex-lover to the crime, police let him go. It's another disappointing dead end.
After a couple of weeks of going through this, talking to countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, neighborhood canvasses, interviews with co-workers, polygraph examinations, it was frustrating as hell.
That was really, really hard on my family. We did not have an answer to who killed Norma. I just wanted not only justice for Norma, I was very concerned for any woman out there. We didn't know who it was. It could be someone that just passed me by. I didn't know. I just wanted him off the streets.
1 month into the investigation, the pressure continues to mount on police to solve the case.
We would get calls from the media every day. Every place we went in the community, they would ask us what was going on, and it was a lot of pressure.
Then, a surprising development. Norma's family contacts police with new information about Beatrice, Norma's coworker and friend.
It turns out that Beatrice was having an affair, and she was using Norma's house as a location for these sexual liaisons. Norma knew about it and in fact condoned it and gave her a copy of her house key.
But why hadn't Beatrice disclosed this detail to police earlier?
We confronted Beatrice with this information. Initially, huge wave of embarrassment. But she laid it out on the line. She told us, you know, the when, the how many times.
Detectives question whether the secret rendezvous led to Norma's murder.
Now we've got other people who had, you know, either continued access to the house. Previously, they were on the periphery of this case. Now they've moved right to the center of it.
One person detectives immediately turned to is Beatrice's husband, who also knew Norma. Had he gone after Norma for helping his wife have a secret affair?
And now, suddenly, Beatrice's husband, he's potentially in the suspect pool. We have to find out if he has an alibi and if we can corroborate it.
He apparently didn't know his wife was having an extramarital affair in Norma's house.
That was not the most comfortable thing to do from an investigative standpoint, but it still had to be done. And, you know, the guy was crushed. He was absolutely crushed.
Detectives questioned Beatrice's husband about his whereabouts on the night of Norma's murder.
He told us that he had been at work late that evening. We talked to a lot of his coworkers. Everything about this man was genuine.
6 months into the investigation of the murder of Norma Rodriguez, detectives worry the trail has gone cold.
We're no closer to narrowing it down than we were on day one.
This case was very mind-boggling. You build up things that, wow, this is going to be great, it's coming together, and then it falls apart. As time progressed, the lead started falling off. It was tough. It was really tough.
Months turn to years. For nearly a decade, the case is at a standstill. But Norma's family doesn't give up.
Every year, we would call the police department for any updates, any new leads or anything. We kept it active. We didn't want this case forgotten.
During this entire investigation, I had the picture of Norma Rodriguez on my desk. I swore to her that I would never give up trying to find out who was responsible.
Then, 10 years to the day Norma was killed. An astonishing break in the case.
Worker with a crime lab. He had a lot of the evidence that we secured in the Norma homicide. He called me and he says, we have a match. We have a match on the DNA.
My head just like exploded with 1,000 thoughts. It was just nuts.
I remember receiving the phone call and it was like winning the lottery.
It's been 10 years since 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez was found in her home, strangled and wrapped in duct tape. The case has remained unsolved, with all leads turning out to be dead ends, until now. With advancements in DNA technology, evidence collected a decade ago has finally yielded results.
At the time of the autopsy of Norma Rodriguez, there were a number of samples that were taken. Hair samples, blood samples, and fingernail clippings.
The crime lab said we have a match on the DNA, and it comes back to Warren Mackey.
Warren, Norma's friend and former coworker who had previously passed a polygraph and had an alibi for the night of the murder. At the time of the investigation, Warren had submitted his DNA and was cooperative.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch. It just blows you away.
Investigators start putting the pieces together about Warren Mackey.
If you're dealing with someone who's a true sociopath, they can get past the polygraph test. So now I'm thinking, all this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
We just went into high gear. We started unraveling everything again and doing what we needed to do.
Detectives start building a case based on forensics.
They evaluated DNA that we had gotten off of Norma's body, and we found Warren's DNA under Norma's fingernails.
The DNA evidence is a major breakthrough, but to build an airtight case, they want more.
The single biggest piece of physical evidence we had at the time was the duct tape. So it got sent off and it got tested.
The DNA that was obtained within the multiple layers of the duct tape was returned to Warren Mackey.
The odds of the DNA match being from someone else besides Warren Mackey was 1 in 810 billion. So we felt pretty confident that this was our person.
Investigators pieced together the events that led up to Norma's murder.
I think this was the classic case of a jilted suitor. And my guess is that he just got a flat-out rejection. He built up his expectations to a point where he couldn't take the fall.
Investigators believe in the early hours of May 31st, Warren Mackey entered Norma's home using keys he had stolen from her purse at the barbecue the day before.
According to Norma's son, Andrew, the house was dark. Many times she would fall asleep watching TV. Maybe she fell asleep on the couch. She had no idea what was about to happen.
Detectives believe that's when Warren strangled Norma.
In his mind, she needed to die because she shouldn't have rejected him.
Then Warren wrapped her head in duct tape.
Trying to depersonalize the scene and covered her face so that he wouldn't see it.
And he ripped that duct tape, handling both ends of the duct tape, wrapped it completely around her face, and left.
Police also believe Norma's 4-year-old son, Austin, was in the next room, not realizing his mother had been murdered.
Austin didn't process because he was a very small child. He was too young to process what had happened. An absolute nightmare.
After Warren kills Norma, he returns to his place in nearby Oxnard as if nothing happened.
I believe that Warren Mackey was the type of person who felt that if I can't have her, nobody can. I think this was one sick individual who had no value for life. He had no right to do what he did.
On August 28, 2003, Ventura County investigators arrest Warren Mackey for the first-degree murder of Norma Rodriguez. Warren pleads not guilty.
During the subsequent 10 years, Warren had settled down. He had gotten married, had a job, was living a very stable life. His friends, neighbors said that he was a nice, caring man.
And for him to live 10 years after that and not even have any remorse, that is not human. I can't imagine what is in a person's head to even hurt another human in that way.
Then, on January 10, 2005, as investigators prepare for trial, the DA receives an unexpected call. Warren Mackey has changed his plea to guilty.
Warren Mackey is an unexpected killer because people didn't see that inner demon, that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life. People just didn't see him that way, but he was that way, and he is that way.
On March 28, 2005, Warren Mackey is sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder of Norma Rodriguez.
Oh, it was phenomenal. It was such an elation. You felt like this weight being lifted.
At the end of the day, we achieved closure for the family, but there's never going to be complete closure.
The devastating loss of the vibrant single mother will forever be felt by her loved ones.
I think about Norma a lot. She was having a good life, and he took it away from her.
It still hurts like it happened yesterday. I miss her in my life. That wound does not heal. We just put it in the back burner. We have to live for Norma, and we have to go forward.
A woman enjoying retirement after a lifetime of hard work.
My mother did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Found brutally murdered in her home.
He stabbed her 24 times.
There was blood throughout the house.
It's like living in a bad horror movie.
A dangerous predator eludes police.
She had been sexually assaulted. Our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
I kept asking them, is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, we're not done yet.
DNA evidence leads to a shocking realization.
It was a match to another murder.
The thought that we had a serial killer here in town scared the hell out of me.
And a suspect no one saw coming.
To call this an unexpected killer is an understatement.
That's like every person's nightmare.
It hit me like a ton of bricks.
Kansas City is a large metropolitan area on the border between Kansas and Missouri.
Kansas City can be a very fun place to be. We love our sports in this city. It's a very friendly place to live.
Nothing seems out of the ordinary on October 29th, 2010, until Kansas City police receive a 911 call about a woman found unresponsive in her home.
A woman called police and said she discovered her mother at the bottom of the basement stairs, and she checked her for vital signs and found she was dead.
When the first officer arrives on the scene, the caller leads them to her 75-year-old mother, Nina Whitney.
I showed them my mother's body laying at the bottom of the stairs. I told the police officers I believe she had just dropped over from a heart attack. And then I called my cousin Kim.
The phone rang and I picked it up, and Paige told me my mother is dead. Paige said she thought maybe Aunt Nina fell down the stairs going to the garage.
While Paige speaks with her cousin on the phone, police take a closer look at Nina's body.
Nina was face down, and there was a shelving unit there with a bunch of glass frogs, and a lot of those frogs had fallen off the shelf on top of her. It initially looks like an accident and a natural death, but when they rolled the victim over, they discovered several stab wounds in her chest. And also what were determined were defensive wounds on her hands, which is something that we see when someone fights back.
Clearly, this is no accident, and detectives arrive to begin a homicide investigation.
When someone's stabbed like the victim was, it usually means there's some sort of emotion tied there because you're actually stabbing someone instead of just shooting them or something like that. Her blouse had been pulled up and there were buttons missing, and they quickly discovered that there what they believed to be saliva on her breast, which they swabbed. So it felt like this was sort of a sexual in nature homicide.
Police inform Paige that her mother has been murdered.
I don't think I've ever been that stunned in my entire life. It's just, it's so surreal. It's like living in a bad horror movie. I don't know how to describe it. You're just totally and completely stunned.
A lifelong native of the Midwest, Nina Whitney was a woman with humble roots.
My mother was born in South Dakota, and then their family wound up here in Kansas City in the late 40s, early 50s. My mother had a very rough life. My mom's mom left their family, so my mom was left to take care of her younger siblings. She married my father, and my parents divorced when I was about 9 years old. My father left her pretty much destitute, so it was just the two of us. And we struggled tremendously. My mother worked some very hard jobs, and we lived on food stamps.
Eventually, Nina found a stable, well-paying career.
She worked on the assembly line at General Motors here in Kansas City. She managed to buy a house, and she did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina wanted a better life for her daughter and encouraged Paige to get an education.
I went into criminal justice at Central Missouri State University, and I was a probation parole officer for 25 years. The older I became, the closer my mother and I became. We spent a tremendous amount of time together. My mother started collecting frogs back in the mid-70s. Ceramic, glass, dishes, clothes, bedding, towels. The entire house was filled, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with frogs.
Nina's favorite hobby earned her the nickname, the Frog Lady.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Investigators are stunned that someone would viciously attack this 75-year-old woman in her home.
I was in total shock, truly. She was in her house, minding her own business, not doing anything wrong. Like, how on earth did that happen?
When I found out Nina had been killed, I couldn't imagine who could have done this. I had no ideas.
Detectives interview Paige to narrow down when the murder might have taken place.
Friday, about 6:45, I decided to call my mother to see what time she wanted to go shopping on Saturday. And that's when she didn't answer the phone. It was extremely unusual for her not to answer the phone. So then I called the cell phone, and she didn't answer that either. Then I started to panic. So then I took off and went out south toward her house. And when I got to her house, the porch light was not on, and I knew something was very wrong. So I walked through to the kitchen, and it was dark. So I turned the light on, and there was her body laying at the bottom of the stairs. And I could feel the back of her head, and her head was ice cold. And I called 911, and then it just kind of hit me out of the blue that I was hearing weird noises. So I followed the noise upstairs to the hall bathroom. Both faucets in the tub were running full blast. And I thought, well, that's just really strange, because my mother didn't use that bathroom.
Detectives wonder if Nina's killer had turned on the faucets, and if so, why?
The victim's daughter had located the guest bathroom bathtub faucets running, and she had turned those faucets off. So the bathroom was processed for fingerprints and DNA.
In the victim's bedroom, there was like an imprint of where it looked like somebody had been laying on the comforter.
And near the bed, we could see buttons that appeared to be similar to the victim's blouse, as well as a hair roller that was similar to the hair rollers in the victim's hair. So that led us to believe that the victim was assaulted, and maybe her blouse may have been torn open at that location.
As every corner of the house is searched for evidence, investigators make a crucial discovery.
We opened up the knife drawer in the kitchen and located a paring knife where the blade was bent and there was blood at the base of the blade near the handle. That could mean that somebody had tried to wipe it clean.
Forensics bagged the knife for further analysis and processed the house with luminol, which can indicate the presence of blood.
The luminol tells us that somebody was moving around in that house with some amount of blood on them. We got that blue glow in the victim's bedroom, bathroom, hallway, living room, and the kitchen.
The front door was unlocked, and we didn't find any sign of forced entry, which was a big clue for us that our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
There's no reason for anyone to hurt her. And my mother was not a very social person at all. She had no family other than me here in town that would be in and out of the house.
Paige points to one detail detectives could not have determined from their search.
There was a shelf by the front door where her cell phone always was, so she could take it when she went out the front door, and it was missing.
Had the killer snatched Nina's cell phone? Police request a trace on it, while officers go door to door looking for witnesses.
One of my other detectives found a party down the street that had seen a white male in the neighborhood earlier that day. He was in his 50s, walking with a limp. The witness saw him go to a black Jeep. He saw that car was parked kind of behind the house, about a block away. And so he sees this guy walking and kind of looking around. And so he just kind of mentally noted it. He kind of looked like he was probably up to no good.
Could the suspicious man be Nina Whitney's killer? As they start to track him down, detectives catch a break.
We found that Nina's phone was still on and still being used in South Kansas City. We were able to do surveillance and observe the person using our victim's cell phone.
Coming up, a break in the case reveals a potential serial killer.
We had another homicide.
There were zip ties that have been used for bindings.
He's terrorized an entire community.
And a grieving daughter takes matters into her own hands.
I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide.
If she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
In my gut, I just knew that was him.
Detectives investigating the vicious stabbing of 75-year-old Nina Whitney believe the killer stole her cell phone. Now, police have traced the phone to an address in South Kansas City and rush to apprehend the suspect.
We did kick his door in, and when we took the suspect into custody, we found that he had the phone on his person.
The suspect goes by the nickname Lil Mickey. Police demand to know how he came into possession of a murdered woman's cell phone.
He told us he was walking down the street pretty close to our victim's house and found that phone laying in the grass. He said he didn't make the most money in the world and was just glad to have a cell phone that was working and started using the cell phone.
Skeptical of his story, investigators ask him if he killed Nina Whitney.
Little Mickey adamantly denied being involved in any sort of violence with our victim or anything where someone was harmed or killed. We asked him, could you have bought this phone off somebody else? Did you get it from a person?
Despite hours of questioning, Lil Mickey stands by his story.
His story was, I found the phone there in the grass and picked it up.
Police want to know his whereabouts at the time of the murder.
Based on her lights being off in the house, we believe Nina's murder happened during daylight hours. And he did provide an alibi, a female that he had been with that day.
Investigators have no grounds to detain Lil Mickey any longer, but they obtain a sample of his DNA just in case.
He wouldn't seem like he would have a motive to commit this type of crime, but we still had to do our due diligence.
The next day, police tracked down the woman he used as his alibi.
So we talked to her. The information she was able to provide, it matched up with what he had been saying.
With Lil Mickey looking unlikely as the killer, detectives turn back to the theory that Nina knew her attacker.
It was obvious that she had let someone in the house because there was absolutely no forced entry.
We had to look at Nina's history and try to figure out who she would have let into the house. And we also had the witness that had seen a white male in the neighborhood. My supervisor thought that a composite sketch would be a good thing to pursue in this case. The witness willingly came down to police headquarters and met with our sketch artist. She sat with him and gave a pretty good-looking composite sketch of what he believed the party looked like that he saw that day. We showed Paige that picture, and she looked at it for a long time, but didn't necessarily jog her memory about who it could possibly be.
The individual did not look familiar to me at all. I could not, for the life of me, think of anyone who fit that description.
Investigators can't be certain if the man seen by Nina's neighbor is the killer. But with few quality leads, police decide to release the sketch to the media.
I was the publisher and editor of the Cass County Democrat-Missourian. We all know that police sketches are an unexact science. However, I think they can be very useful. So we had run the sketch in the newspaper to put that sketch out to a larger audience.
As the sketch goes public, detectives work with Paige to come up with a list of people that Nina would have had a reason to let into her home.
She'd had quite a bit of work done on the house in the last year or so there had been lots of people in and out working on the house.
Maybe someone that is a predator did work inside her house and decided that she would be a good victim. Paige went back into Nina's home and went through all of her records to show us dates and times when she had stuff done at her house.
The detectives got all that information from me and questioned everyone who had been in and out of that house.
My squad started working to collect DNA from anyone that we thought had contact with Nina. And I think we collected about 40 to 50 samples. Honestly, most people were willing to provide their DNA to us when we explained that this was an elderly woman that was brutally murdered. If there was someone that maybe we thought was fishy or involved or could potentially be the suspect, DNA is good to rule people out in cases like this.
The forensics lab will compare the scores of samples to the DNA recovered from Nina's body.
It'd be nice as a detective to get DNA results like they do on TV, 5 seconds later. But it was about a month after the homicide when we got our results back. My boss called me and she said that we had a DNA hit. So I thought that, well, if there's a DNA hit, then we'll be able to find a suspect. But that wasn't the case because it was unknown DNA.
The DNA does not match the dozens of samples collected by homicide investigators.
Everything from the mailman to Little Mickey to contractors that had been inside her house. It rules them out, absolutely. But the DNA profile that was found was a match to another murder almost 2 years to the day in Harrisonville, Missouri. So we knew at that point that this was not the first time that this suspect did this. And that wasn't something I expected. It was a big deal. What concerned us was that we did have a serial killer type situation.
One month after the murder of Nina Whitney, DNA taken from the crime scene as matched to another homicide in the national database.
It was a match to another unsolved murder in Harrisonville, Missouri. It's a smaller town, about an hour south of Kansas City. Kara Jo Roberts was found inside her home in the bathtub, shot in the head with the bathtub running, just like Nina. It seemed like a sexually motivated homicide, and with the tub running, that matches Nina at our scene.
Police decide to keep this explosive new information under wraps.
At that point, we were trying to keep this information close to the chest because the suspect didn't know that we knew both crime scenes were connected. We did not want that in the public.
Detectives even withhold this new development from the victims' loved ones, including Paige.
I kept asking them, when is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, well, not yet. We're not done yet. And I don't know what they were doing, but I know they were doing things behind the scenes.
Investigators head to Harrisonville to get briefed on the Kara Jo Roberts case.
Just reading through a case file doesn't give you the whole story. So to talk to an investigator that actually worked that case, it helps paint a better picture of what happened in the other investigation.
I was one of the detectives from Kansas City at the time that was sent to work on this case. Kara Jo and her husband lived right there in the small town. They had a kid. It seemed like a very happy relationship. Just your normal, happy family.
The Roberts family was devastated by a horrific tragedy on November 5th, 2008.
Her husband found Kara in the bathroom. She wasn't wearing any clothes. There were obvious gunshot injuries. She was in the bathtub, and the bathtub was running. There were zip ties that we speculated at the time had been used for bindings.
At the Kara Jo Roberts scene, we found 2 different white-colored zip ties that appear to have been used but cut. We also found a roll of duct tape. On both the zip ties and the duct tape, we had male DNA.
There was DNA found on Kara's body, and there was indications given by the medical examiner that she had been sexually assaulted.
Detectives investigating Nina's murder ask for a rundown of the suspects in Kara Jo's case.
Based on the fact of no forced entry, very much kind of angled towards us believing that the husband may have had something to do with this. A domestic violence type homicide is usually spur of the moment, rage and kind of action, but this could have been a situation where he was trying to control her physically with the bindings, and then it escalated.
Kara Jo's husband claimed he found his wife dead when he got home from work and immediately called 911.
From the time she was last seen to the time when her husband came home and found her was a very tight window. It was only like 45 minutes. Her husband gave what was kind of a complex alibi, but when we went to talk to his friends who were involved in that alibi, they were able to corroborate everything.
DNA testing at the time also cleared Kara Jo's husband, and no other viable suspects were identified. The investigation went cold until the DNA connection to Nina Whitney's murder revives the case 2 years later.
Nina's homicide was a lifeline to the Kara Jo Roberts case. We have double information, and we have a bigger picture of what's going on in both of these acts.
What we have to do at that point is start doing what's called victimology. You basically have to understand the circle of Kara Jo's world, and you look at the circle of Nina's world. You know these 2 cases are linked, and you want to find those commonalities in between.
What was really interesting was all the stuff in the Kara Jo Roberts case that matched up to Nina's case. As far as the tub running, we had a lot of different theories, but our main one was if our suspect was going to commit a rape, they would want to use that tub to wash away evidence after the act. In Nina's case, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub. He may have not been able to drag her body up those stairs. Our witness down the street sees this guy walking with a limp, and we thought the limp may have hindered him from getting her body back up to the tub. So just like our case, the Kara Jo Roberts case had someone down the street that saw someone in the neighborhood.
The witness had seen a Jeep, had seen a male going to the Jeep, and that male may have been limping.
And it looked like they were up to no good.
Despite the telling parallels, police can't find anyone connected to both Nina and Kara Jo.
That was not the answer that we wanted as detectives, because that meant that it was somebody totally random. A random person coming in and taking their life. That's like every person's nightmare.
In a case like this, where you know there's a suspect out there that could do this again, it makes it even more urgent to try to catch the person. So you're grasping at straws, looking for any leads, any information, any help you can get to try to solve a case like this.
You can only work with what information you've got coming in, and there wasn't any new information coming in at that point.
Running out of options, detectives turn to the one person who might be able to connect the 2 victims.
Detective Blank called me, and he said, "Paige, I have something to tell you." And what he told me was more horrifying than my mother's homicide. That scared the hell out of me.
Detectives investigating the stabbing death of Nina Whitney have informed her daughter Paige about a stunning development.
Detective Blank told me that there was a DNA match from the saliva they found on my mother's shirt to DNA that they found on Kara Roberts in Harrisonville. Kara had been raped, put in the bathtub, and then shot in the back of the head. The thought that we had a serial killer here in town is enough to cause panic for every female in this city.
We provided information from both crime scenes to Paige. And that's not something we would normally tell our victim's daughter. But in this case, Paige was a probation and parole officer. She is savvy in law enforcement, so we thought we could trust her with that information. We wanted to see if anything in her memory would be jogged to try to figure out if there's any common people, common locations that both victims would have known or gone to.
At the time, I thought it had to be someone who targeted my mother specifically. But when they showed me the evidence in Kara's case, there's just a million things to think about when you're trying to come up with a profile for someone like that.
There wasn't much there that seemed to be connected between the two victims. There wasn't an aha moment in that meeting at all.
It's been 5 months since the murder of Nina Whitney, and investigators are desperate for a break. They turn back to the composite sketch of the man with the limp seen close to Nina's house.
I wasn't necessarily a believer in the composite sketch thing. People make their own determination on whether they think the information they have is valuable to a case. They see that sketch and they decide, well, this guy's got glasses and the guy I know doesn't have glasses. And so the danger in that is that that person may have information, but that person may be turned off by the sketch.
We had run the sketch in the newspaper, but really that sketch hadn't brought in a lot of leads.
Despite their reservations, police hope that more people will see the sketch on billboards around the city, and someone will identify the suspect.
They were able to put that picture along 71 Highway, along with our tips hotline. The number of tips that we received on this case based on that sketch were not as numerous as you would think. All of them have to be followed up on, because there could be something there that you're gonna miss if you don't take those tips seriously.
Weeks pass as investigators chase down leads that go nowhere. The lack of progress takes a heavy toll on Nina's family.
I was really angry that she died in her own home in that terror and that panic, helpless and alone and fighting for her life.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I think about my mother's last few minutes of life. I know the neighbor was home next door and nobody heard my mother screaming. I wake up to the sound of her screaming 2, 3 o'clock every morning. It doesn't go away. It does not go away.
There's nothing worse than having to tell a family member, I'm sorry, there's no new information coming in, because they're frustrated. They're of the mindset that, why aren't you out there doing something?
At her wit's end, Paige summons the strength she learned from Nina growing up and takes it upon herself to search for the killer.
The investigation was not moving fast enough to make me happy, so I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide. I drove around the city and went to every antique shop, every flea market, every thrift store I could think of where she liked to shop.
She was looking for that white male walking with a limp and that black Jeep. And Paige was seeing black Jeeps like that everywhere.
I would take pictures of all the cars that looked like black Jeeps and all the license plates on those vehicles and forwarded all of those to the detectives.
Paige made it her job to be involved, and if she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
I can't even explain to you how badly I needed to know who murdered my mother.
Despite Paige's efforts, 6 months after her mother's death, the investigation starts to go cold.
Those kind of unsolved cases in Kansas City leave an entire metro area on edge. As the days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, how do you keep that case alive within the pages of your newspaper? Most of our weekly papers did not include an update because there was nothing to update in the case.
I kept thinking, this is going to be a cold case. I'm never going to figure it out. I'm never going to figure it out.
You always hope for them to get information to catch a suspect quickly, but I just couldn't fathom who would have done it. I had no suspects in mind.
I drove around and took pictures of the billboards because I wanted to make sure I got pictures of them before they had taken them down. But the sketch concerned me because I don't know if that description was accurate. I thought there's just so many questions that I will never have answers to.
Suddenly, 1 month later, Paige has a realization.
May 26th, 2011, I was driving down 71 Highway in rush hour traffic, and I just happened to glance up and look at the lower half of the billboard, and I swear to you, it hit me like a ton of bricks. like lightning had come out of the sky and hit me in the head. It literally all fell into place as I'm driving down the highway.
Seven months after the murder of Nina Whitney, her daughter Paige has just been struck by a mind-blowing realization.
I was driving down 71 Highway, and I just happened to glance up at the billboard. Prior to that, when they showed me the sketch, the individual did not look familiar to me at all. I just focused on the lower half of his face and the chin, and it just an epiphany. It was Jeff. Jeff Moreland was a boyfriend that I had for 3 years while we were in college. We met in 1983 at Central Missouri State University, had a relationship for 3 years. Jeff and I met in a criminal justice class. He was as sweet and charming and funny as he could possibly be, and I truly fell head over heels in love with him. Once I got my graduate degree, I became a social worker, and Jeff went on to become a police officer. He loved being a police officer. That was his ideal dream job.
Paige and Jeff broke up after 3 years of dating, much to her mother's dismay.
My mother absolutely adored him. For years after we dated, my mother told me she wished I had married him. I know if he showed up on the doorstep, she would happily have let him in the house.
Could Paige's ex-boyfriend from 2 decades prior really be the sadistic serial killer detectives have been hunting for?
I was so lost in my own head, trying to tell myself that Jeff didn't do it. I kept trying to tell myself that I was wrong, but in my gut, I just knew that was him. At the parole office, I'd mentioned it to a couple of the girls that I work with, and they told me that I should run him through the system. So, well, that makes sense. So I ran Jeff through the system. And lo and behold, if he didn't have a black Jeep Wrangler registered in his name, and I nearly lost my cookies. And I also found out Jeff had been a police officer in the Grandview Police Department, but Jeff had retired about 5 years prior to my mother's homicide because he'd had Parkinson's.
Does the Parkinson's diagnosis mean Paige's ex could be the man with a limp spotted near Nina's home? Paige brings her findings to detectives.
I told him that Jeff had been a police officer in Grandview and gave him all the information that I had.
Officers look up Jeff Moreland's home address and discover he lives in the same small town as the first murder victim, Kara Jo Roberts.
He lived in Harrisonville, Missouri. So that was the first person during our investigation that matched all of those factors.
Detective Blank said, yep, it could be him.
Detectives know they have to take extra care when investigating an ex-cop.
Harrisonville is a very small community, and Detective Blank told me that Jeff knew every law enforcement officer in the county, and that he would find out that he was under investigation.
Investigators decide a direct approach is the best option.
We did not believe that we had probable cause at that point to get a search warrant to get his DNA. So we went down and knocked on his front door. I did tell him, your name's come up in a homicide, and we need to get a DNA sample from you. If someone were to tell me that, I'd be like, what homicide are you talking about? That was not Mr. Moreland's reaction. He said, well, I've got to go take my cat to the vet, and he went back inside his house. My gut was telling me that we had our guy, but you need to be sure that this is your guy before you go with your gut.
Police again ask Jeff to provide a voluntary DNA sample.
I ended up calling him and telling him again that, hey, we need your DNA to compare to this homicide, and then we'll be done.
Jeff again claims that he's too busy to provide a sample. A week later, investigators receive an unexpected phone call from the police department Jeff retired from, located just outside Kansas City.
So the sergeant with Grandview Police Department calls us and says that he's been in contact with Jeff Moreland and he provided him a DNA sample. We rushed down there and we made contact with the sergeant. On his desk, he had a pill bottle
The sergeant provides a strange account of how he obtained Jeff's DNA.
Jeff told him that, I want you to meet me at this gas station along 71 Highway. And Jeff shows up in his black Jeep. And Jeff tells him that Kansas City has come and accused him of being involved in a murder. As he's explaining the story, he takes swabs and puts them in his mouth, and then Jeff hands him this bottle along with my card and says, here, give this to the detectives. We tell the sergeant, that sample's not gonna work. You can't just provide your own sample. And the sergeant sort of indicated, well, we'll just get rid of it in the trash then. We told him, no, we'll take that bottle off his hands and take that from him.
The evidentiary value of this stuff is just worthless. But obviously, we recover it and we examine it.
That DNA was tested, and it did not match our homicide.
The fact that that DNA came back as not a match just didn't surprise me at all. Had he followed the protocol, that would have exonerated him. And he very easily could have done that, but he chose not to.
We more and more really thought that we might have had our suspect based on his actions at that point. We all know about serial killers. I was worried that the suspect was going to do this act again.
A few days later, detectives get the call they've been dreading.
I received a phone call. There was a rape that occurred in Harrisonville. But the victim was able to get away, and then she was able to contact police. The victim took the officers to where this event had occurred the day before. It was Jeff Moreland's residence. So my first question is, where's Moreland at now?
When police go to arrest Jeff, he's nowhere to be found.
Detective Blank told me Jeff may have raped a third victim, and he is now on the run. I didn't know if he would be after me. I didn't know if maybe he had figured out that it was me who initially contacted the police. That was a nightmare.
Former police officer Jeff Moreland is the prime suspect in the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney. Tragically, a third woman has now been attacked, but Jeff has disappeared, and investigators fear he may strike again.
When I heard that he had taken off, I was worried about Paige.
The detectives told me they truly did not know where he had gone or what he knew. I told Detective Blank he would probably find Jeff in Iowa near his family.
As Paige predicted, a trace on Jeff's cell phone leads police to a motel in Iowa.
He had taken a bunch of over-the-counter sleeping pills. He tried to take his own life and then ended up in a hospital in Des Moines.
Jeff survives the suicide attempt, and he is taken into custody by local police.
We headed up there to Iowa to get Mr. Moreland's DNA. We drove all the way back from Iowa with it. We wanted to be sure he wasn't going to get out of custody or bond out or whatever. And then the next morning, we got the DNA results back. We told Paige that his DNA matched both crime scenes. Jeff is, in fact, involved in the murders of Kara Jo and Nina.
It just blows my mind. And it was beyond all comprehension to me. This was 2010 when he murdered my mother. And Jeff and I split up in 1987. I had no idea what Jeff would become. The last time I actually saw Jeff was in 1994. He told me then that he periodically would patrol up and down my mother's street just to make sure that everything was okay. And at the time I thought, oh, that's so sweet. But now looking back on it, I just don't know.
Jeff Moreland is charged with the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney and the sexual assault of the third victim. Soon after laying charges, investigators learn about the source of Jeff's phony DNA.
We were contacted by Jeff Moreland's ex-wife, and Jeff Moreland had a daughter with this ex-wife, and that daughter was engaged to someone. And that guy said that Jeff had called him out of the blue, and Jeff told him that he needed a sample of his DNA for a paternity test because someone was accusing Jeff of being the father of a kid And so he provided a DNA sample and gave it to Jeff Moreland.
Then, Jeff tricked the Grandview police sergeant with some sleight of hand.
So the sergeant provided us a formal statement where he said he wasn't able to see Moreland's hands at all times when Moreland was taking a sample of his DNA.
Jeff's attempted deception backfires, only giving prosecutors more evidence against him.
There's nothing for the defense to attack. There's nothing to be argued because the physical evidence was just overwhelming.
I think it also says a lot that Jeffrey Moreland had 0 witnesses in his defense at the trial.
He got life without parole plus 50 years consecutive on Kara Roberts' homicide. And then he got 10 years for armed criminal action and 20 years for murder second on my mother's case to run concurrent.
With no trial testimony from Jeff, police and the victims' families are left to piece together exactly what happened to Nina Whitney and Kara Jo Roberts.
What we do know is that Jeff Moreland took Kara Jo's life. My personal opinion is he was driving by and saw her in the yard, and he was in that mode where he was hunting and decided that's his target.
After killing Kara Jo, it seems Jeff developed a taste for murder. He struck again 2 years later.
I believe the day that Nina was murdered, Jeff Moreland simply knocked on the door and Nina saw who it was and let him in the house. It's not necessarily uncommon for a predator to go after older women because they feel like they are easier victims.
Of course, my mother would let him in. And then at some point, he had to have started forcing her backwards up the stairs. I think when he got her into her bedroom, then he tried to rip her shirt off of her, forced her onto the bed, but she did fight back. She did run. My mother went running down the stairs. He chased her. He stabbed her 24 times. The kill shot was here through the throat.
At some point, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub to wash off his DNA.
But at that point, he knew with his Parkinson's acting up that there was no way he was going to be able to take her body back up 2 flights of stairs and put her in a bathtub. And then he went upstairs to clean the knife off, put the knife in the kitchen drawer, and went out through the sliding glass door.
Investigators believe that before he left, Moreland stole Nina's cell phone to throw police off his trail.
He has the presence of mind to grab that phone and throw that phone in the grass a quarter mile away from Nina's house. He knows that the investigator is going to be caught up in that phone as sort of a way to lead us away from him.
I did not know for 8 months who murdered my mother. The 8 months that I spent not knowing made me insane.
When you have families that do their investigations, sometimes it's not the best. But Paige being involved was actually good in this case because she was actually the person that found Jeff Moreland.
I can't even explain to you how grateful I am. Between my mother's neighbor and the sketch artist, I would have never figured it out. Never would have figured it out if it hadn't been for the 2 of them.
To call this an unexpected killer is almost an understatement. Jeff Moreland terrorized an entire community.
Police speculate that Jeff's forced retirement a few years before the murders may have been the catalyst that set him on the path to kill.
I feel that when he developed Parkinson's and he had his power taken away from him as a police officer, the murders were almost like him getting revenge on the world.
I joined this organization called Parents of Murdered Children and Other Survivors of Homicide Victims. And we're all basically going through the same thing. So it does help to have someone who understands the enormity of what has happened.
I think Nina would want to be remembered as a strong, independent woman who fought to the end. And that's how I'll always remember her.
There are frogs in the stores everywhere. You can't go anywhere without seeing cute little frogs somewhere. I think about my mother all the time when I see things that I know that she would appreciate, or when I hear country music. I think about her a lot.
প্রিয় দর্শক, আবারও স্বাগতম আপনাদের সবার নতুন ভিডিওতে। তো এখন আপনাদের যে খবরটি শোনাবো সেটি হচ্ছে মিয়ানমার ইস্যুতে একটি খবর শোনাবো, যে বাংলাদেশের দেশীয় অভ্যন্তরে মিয়ানমারের যে আপনারা জানেন যে রোহিঙ্গাদেরকে আমরা জায়গা দিয়েছিলাম, এরপর এখন মিয়ানমারের সে যে ঘটনা ঘটছে, এখন নতুন করে অনেক লোক বাংলাদেশে ঢুকছে, প্রতিনিয়ত অনেক সেনা সদস্যও বাংলাদেশে ঢুকছে। তো এটা নিয়ে বাংলাদেশের একটা অস্থিরতা তৈরি হচ্ছে। তো এখন আমরা দেখতে পেলাম যে মিয়ানমার প্রতি আর কোনো উদারতা দেখানোর সুযোগ নেই বলেছেন ওবায়দুল কাদের। তো এই সংবাদের আপনাদেরকে একটু ভিতরে নিয়ে আপনাদেরকে কিছু তথ্য খবর দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করব। সেটা হচ্ছে আওয়ামী লীগ সাধারণ সম্পাদক এবং সড়ক পরিবহন ও সেতুমন্ত্রী ওবায়দুল কাদের বলেছেন, মিয়ানমারের প্রতি আর উদারতা দেখানোর সুযোগ নেই, কোনো অবস্থাতে বাস্তুচ্যুতদের ঢুকতে দেওয়া হবে না। মিয়ানমার ইস্যুতে আর কোনো উদারতা দেখানো সম্ভব নয় এবং সেখান থেকে নতুন কেউ বাংলাদেশে এলে তাকে গ্রহণ করা হবে না। অর্থাৎ আমরা যারা বাংলাদেশি মানুষ আসলে এতটাই বিনয়ী, এতটাই ভদ্র বা এতটাই তারা বন্ধুসুলভ যে একটা দেশ থেকে যখন এটা কোনো দেশ ঢুকতে দিবে না, ধরেন বাংলাদেশের কোনো মানুষকে ইন্ডিয়া ঢুকতে দিবে বা চীনে ঢুকতে দিবে, তো এটা হবে না। কিন্তু আমরা সেই মিয়ানমারে যখন রাখাইনদের বের করে দেওয়া হয়েছিল, আমরা তখন বাংলাদেশকে আশ্রয় দিয়েছিলাম। অর্থাৎ প্রায় 10 লক্ষ মানুষকে আমরা এই বাংলাদেশের বুকে তাদেরকে আশ্রয় দিয়েছি, তাদের জন্য একটা ক্যাম্প করে দেওয়া হয়েছে। সুতরাং আমাদের মতো দেশে আমাদের মতো দরিদ্র দেশ, যেখানে আমাদেরই সমস্যা হয় দেশে সংকট উত্তরণে কাজ করতে, বা আমাদের যেখানে অর্থনৈতিকভাবে আমরা সেভাবে স্টেবল না, সেই দেশেও এরকম একটা সিচুয়েশনে আমরা তাদেরকে জায়গায় দিয়েছি, ভরণপোষণ দিয়েছি, তাদেরকে খাওয়াচ্ছি। তো এখন আবার নতুন করে যদি তারা আসে এটা আর সম্ভব হবে না, কারণ আমরা ইতিমধ্যেই এত সংগ্রহ করেছি যে 10 লক্ষ 12 লক্ষ মানুষ আমরা গ্রহণ করেছি এবং এদেরকেই ফিরিয়ে দেওয়াটা আমাদের জন্য চ্যালেঞ্জ হয়ে যাচ্ছে। তো আজ ধার্মিক আওয়ামী লীগ সভাপতি শেখ হাসিনার রাজনৈতিক কার্যালয়ের সংবাদ সম্মেলনে সাংবাদিকদের প্রশ্নের জবাবে ওবায়দুল কাদের এসব কথা বলেন। আওয়ামী লীগের সাধারণ সম্পাদক বলেন, মিয়ানমার ইস্যুতে স্বরাষ্ট্রমন্ত্রী যা বলেছেন সেটাই আমাদের সরকার ও দলের বক্তব্য। ঘটনাস্থলের পাশাপাশি কয়েকটি গ্রাম নিয়ে আমরা উদ্বিগ্ন, পররাষ্ট্র মন্ত্রণালয় নিশ্চয়ই এ ব্যাপারে কথা বলবে, যত উস্কানি আসুক আমরা প্রতিক্রিয়া দেব না। তো ওবায়দুল কাদের আরও বলেন, ওই দেশে অভ্যন্তরীণ থেকে ছেঁড়া মর্টারের শেল পড়েছে আমাদের সীমান্তে, এর মধ্যে 3 জন গুলিবিদ্ধ হয়েছেন, আবার আকাশসীমা লঙ্ঘন করেছে। তাদের নিজেদের সমস্যার কারণে আমরা সমস্যার সম্মুখীন হব কেন? এতে জাতিসংঘ ও চীন উদ্যোগ নেওয়া উচিত। ওবায়দুল কাদের বলেন, এখানে কনফ্লিক্ট অফ ইন্টারেস্ট তাদের নিজস্ব, তবে তা পাশের দেশের জন্য যাতে আতঙ্ক না হয় এটা আমাদের দেখতে হবে। এ ব্যাপারে জাতিসংঘ হস্তক্ষেপ প্রয়োজন। চীনের রাষ্ট্রদূতকে বলেছে, যেহেতু মিয়ানমার চীনের কথা শুনে তাই তাদের ভূমিকায় রাখতে হবে। বাংলাদেশের সহযোগিতা আহ্বান জানিয়েছে চীন। যুক্তরাষ্ট্র ও বিএনপিকে ছেড়ে চলে গেছে উল্লেখ করে আওয়ামী লীগের সাধারণ সম্পাদক বলেন, আমেরিকার প্রেসিডেন্ট বাইডেন একসাথে কাজ করার অঙ্গীকার জানানোর পর বিএনপি এখন কি করবে? তাদের এখন কি বলার আছে? ক্ষমতা বসানোর জন্য কে আসবে? ক্ষমতা থেকে হটানো বা ক্ষমতায় আসার সহায়তা কে করবে? তো এটা নিয়ে এখন বিএনপি চিন্তিত এবং তিনি মনে করছেন, ওবায়দুল কাদের বলেন, দেশের যারা নির্বাচনে বিরোধিতা করছে, নির্বাচন থেকে সরে গিয়ে নির্বাচন প্রতিরোধের চেষ্টা, সন্ত্রাসী কার্যকলাপ চালিয়েছে, তাদের চেষ্টার কোনো সুফল হয়নি। বিশেষ করে ভিসা নীতি বা নিষেধাজ্ঞা ইস্যুতে যুক্তরাষ্ট্র তাদের পাশে থাকেনি। এ সময় আরও উপস্থিত ছিলেন আর দলের আরও অনেক সিনিয়র নেতৃত্ববৃন্দ।